Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 399. We are of course therefore only one Drydock away from Drydock 400 and 5 Drydocks away from when the Drydock shall not be found. Nonetheless, it is the Patreon Drydock, so it's the last Sunday of the month, and therefore there are an awful lot of questions to answer, so we're just going to get stuck straight into them. Michael Gilson asks, inspired by your March videos on battlecruisers in general and the US Navy's battlecruisers in particular, if the two middle turrets and barbettes of HMS Agincourt had been removed, would the weight reduction have been enough to get her up to battlecruiser speed? And if not, if that space was used for additional machinery, would that get her to battlecruiser speed? And how long would all these changes take? Did the Royal Navy consider at the time perhaps it was more important to get more dreadnoughts, or was there a desire for more battlecruisers? So, sort of in reverse order, at the time that she was taken over, the Royal Navy considered that having more battleships was more important than battlecruisers, because in early 1913, and indeed before they'd fully commissioned Agincourt, Erin, and Canada in late 1914, the German Imperial Navy got close to the number of dreadnoughts the Royal Navy had. At both of those points, the difference was just 3 ships. Now, of course, by taking Erin, Canada, and Agincourt and putting them in service, that doubled that gap. And, of course, as we've covered many times, the Royal Navy kept producing more and more ships, so the gap opened up quite considerably. But in the specific time period when the Royal Navy was looking at what do we do with these ships? Battleships were more important to give the Grand Fleet a superiority in a battle line. Because of the kind of numbers of ships you're talking about at that point, a 3-ship margin was really a no-ship margin, because obviously the Germans would be able to choose to a certain degree when they came out and fought the Grand Fleet. So if they caught the Grand Fleet with, say, 3 or 4 ships off in refit, and the Germans timed their ships going out to be the optimal time when every one of their ships was in service, then of course there would be no advantage for the Royal Navy, and perhaps even a slight disadvantage by 1 or 2 ships. Also, just in general, turning Agincourt into a 10-gun battlecruiser would have taken considerable time, at which point, obviously, she's not in either the battle fleet or the battlecruiser fleet. But if they had chosen to do it, well, I think this diagram is fairly helpful. So you can see that the central space is occupied partly by the auxiliary machinery and partly by the magazines and etc. for the 12-inch guns. Now, she was capable of just over 22 knots, almost 22.5 knots, on a little bit over 40,000 shaft horsepower. She was designed for less, but she achieved more horsepower and therefore achieved a higher top speed as a result, at least when she was on trials. Now, just removing the turrets and their associated machinery, while it would make her a little bit lighter and therefore a little bit faster, it's still not going to get her anywhere close to battlecruiser speed. However, if we use the very basic formula that is used to work out, this is the current power and the current speed, and therefore you need this amount of power to go to this desired speed, which I've mentioned in previous dry docks. If we plug those numbers in, so she's reaching 22.42 knots at just over 40,000 shaft horsepower by default. Default battle cruiser speed, so to keep up with, say, the Invincibles, is 25 knots. That suggests, in theory, all other stuff aside, she'd need just over 55,000 shaft horsepower to reach 25 knots. And then if you, again, because we're looking at this from a very crude perspective, if we look at the areas on this plan where the magazines are, if we take those magazines and turrets out and then shift the auxiliary machinery either fore or aft to abut one of the boiler rooms, then that gives us, at least from a side-on profile, basically enough area to fit another boiler room. Now, of course, the reason I've included a side-on and a top-down view is that you can see the forward 2 boiler rooms are on a thinner part of the ship where there is less beam, and the aftmost boiler room is at near enough one of the widest points of the ship where there's more beam. So if we move the auxiliary machinery spaces slightly forward and then put the fourth boiler room basically below where the aftmost of the middle two turrets is and where the auxiliary space is at the moment, that will give us fractionally more boiler space than if we did it the other way around. And of course, that boiler room is going to have generally a bit more space than the forward two boiler rooms. So all of these details plus various calculations make this all a very crude estimate. But if we just say it's a fourth boiler room, therefore we can divide the 40,000 shaft horsepower by 3, multiply by 4. So that would give us about 53,500 shaft horsepower. That's quite close to reaching 25 knots. It's not enough in and of itself, but if you then, again, ballparking, account for the fact you can probably maybe get one or two more boilers in this new boiler room than you can perhaps in the very foremost boiler room, because very much has 22 water tube boilers, so there's quite a lot of small boilers involved here. Plus the fact that the weight of the machinery is probably not going to be more than the weight of the turrets and the barbettes and the magazines and the shell rooms. It's probably going to be a bit less, so she's going to be a little bit lighter as well. Then, assuming that the turbines and the propeller shafts and everything can take it and we don't have cavitation dropping off power requirements and everything, I think it would be possible at an absolute push to maybe just about get Agincourt up to about 25 knots if you stripped out those two central turrets, completely redid the central portion of the ship and added a fourth boiler room. However, that's an awful lot of caveats and generalizations. If it was a rough and ready conversion, you'd probably maybe get 24 and a half knots, at which point she'd be fast enough to maybe form a weird ancillary to 5th Battle Squadron, or indeed, maybe by 1916 she could just about keep up with some of the Invincible-Indefatigable class that maybe hadn't been into a dockyard period for a very long time. The flip side to that, of course, is that if you really finessed the design, if you're going to do this massive strip down and refit of her internal spaces, you may as well do something like, add a little bow extension or something like that. Then if you're prepared to put the time and money in, you probably could comfortably get her up to 25 knots in the World War I time period. Marlin Stout asks, while the actions of American naval intelligence and code breakers were pretty well documented, especially in the US, how good or bad were the naval intelligence services of the other belligerent powers in World War II? It's a pretty wide-ranging field when you look at cryptanalysis and cryptography in World War II. The British, of course, famously have Bletchley Park, and they centralise their efforts to a great degree. So while there is British naval intelligence, as it were, it's not working solely on, we're the naval intelligence guys, we break German naval codes, and that's all we're interested in. Obviously, British naval intelligence was primarily interested in the naval side of things, but when it came to code breaking and such, they weren't operating in their own little silo. Bletchley Park was interested in breaking German naval codes, army codes, Luftwaffe codes, any codes they could really get their hands on, and obviously by centralising their efforts they ended up with a fair bit of success. When it came to the Japanese, it'll come to the surprise of practically nobody that the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy had their own separate code-breaking agencies, and they had an intense rivalry between each other, like their parent services. And this had mixed results, because on the one hand, obviously, if you have two separate intelligence services working on code-breaking, then you're not pooling all your resources into one, so you will have some diminished efforts. On the other hand, they hated each other so much they actively competed to outdo each other, which drove efforts perhaps a little bit more intensely. The Japanese as a whole, roughly speaking, were able to break a fair number of codes, but a lot of the codes that they broke were Chinese and Soviet codes, because, well, they were actively fighting the Chinese and they were very worried about the Soviets. They did manage to break some of the lower-level American and British codes, as far as I'm aware. But, again, as far as I'm aware, the Japanese never cracked the really high-level stuff, the kind of Enigma equivalents that the British and the Americans used, which obviously somewhat negatively affected their war effort. The Germans were perhaps the worst off, because if you think having two competing intel agencies is bad, the Germans had something like a dozen, all siloed, all doing their own thing, and all, for the most part, deathly unwilling to actually work with each other. So you could end up occasionally with situations where one department had managed to crack a particular code, but because it didn't necessarily really affect the area of the war effort they were concerned with, they wouldn't really do all that much with it, but they also wouldn't tell the department that could use that information that they had deciphered that code. So, for example, if you had, let's say, a department that was mainly interested in decoding Allied Air Force encryption so that they could work out when the Allies were going to send bombers over to Germany. That's fairly important, obviously. Now, let's say that while they're doing that, they are obviously listening to transmissions coming off of the, let's say, the UK's eastern coastline, and they happen to intercept a bunch of traffic from the coastal convoys. Now, of course, this information would be really, really handy for the Kriegsmarine for their coastal U-boat operations. However, if the Air Force decoding system decodes those messages, there's a fairly high likelihood they'll just be like, okay, cool, we've decoded that encryption system, but that doesn't really affect our mission. Put that to one side. Should we tell the Navy? Nah, let's not tell the Navy. That's too much like hard work. They wouldn't tell us if they had decoded, say, some of the Air Force codes, so why should we tell them? And a mirror situation may well exist in the other department. So, with that said, while there were plenty of missed opportunities as a result, the Germans had actually compromised a number of Royal Navy ciphers before the war even started. And for the first half of the war, they managed to break more of the Royal Navy ciphers and codes than they didn't, although some did remain secure. A particularly big failure was the one that was used for the convoys in 1941 through 43, Naval Cipher number 3. It should have been replaced really every 6 to 8 months, but partly because of the mess at that point of trying to integrate the various free navies, the Canadians and the Americans, into the convoy system and various other situations, it just wasn't replaced for far, far longer than ideal. And on top of that, the sheer amount of convoy traffic that was created meant that it became relatively easy for the Germans to find situations where particular communications were clearly sent using the same particular encipherment method, because it was a table-based system. And that obviously then enabled them to gradually break the system over time, which had obviously negative consequences for the convoys. However, even during the first part of the war, the Germans didn't manage to crack all the Royal Navy's codes and ciphers. Some of the highest level ones did remain in place. And the British, although they didn't necessarily precisely pin down, yes, we have definitive proof the Germans have broken this code all the time, they did realise that some of the things the Germans were doing probably indicated that they had confidential information from the Allies, and since the British had been so good at compromising the Germans' physical agents on the ground, the only logical conclusion would have been that one or more of their codes had been broken, and they started replacing code books and putting in additional cipher layers and everything. So as the war went on, British security got better and better, and the German code breakers basically were unable to keep up. Now, if the Germans had had a Bletchley Park-style single large organisation that was looking at deciphering the Allied codes, they may have been able to keep up for longer, but part of it was just by constantly replacing both the code books and the further encipherment sheets. It meant that even if you let's say the British in December 43, they start a new code book for a certain region. Okay, now you're back to square one as the Germans. And if even with a big central organisation, which they didn't have, after 4 months, you've been able to build a certain portion of the code book, so you know some of what they're saying at least. Well, that gives you some information for a couple of months, and then in June 44, the British changed the code book again, and it sets you back to square one. And that was essentially the major problem the Germans faced, coupled with these very siloed intel agencies. It meant they couldn't, by the mid to late part of the war, they couldn't even get that far most of the time. The Italians would be the last of the major combatants. I mean, technically the Soviets, but I know literally next to nothing about Soviet cryptography in World War II. But the Italians certainly did actually better than the Germans, partly because they didn't have quite as fragmented a intel security apparatus, and partly because they just seemed to be slightly better at code breaking. So they had similar levels of success to the Germans, and perhaps a little bit more at penetrating various Allied code signals, obviously also helped by the fact that they weren't really interested all that much in what British signals in the North Atlantic or the Indian Ocean and so forth were doing. It was mostly, what are they talking about in the Mediterranean, for obvious reasons. But yeah, generally they had a higher level of performance than the German code breakers. How they would have fared against the improved British signal security from 43 onwards, obviously we don't know, because the Italians bowed out of the war, at least on the Axis side for the most part, in 1943, and at that point, obviously, their efforts to crack Allied cryptography came to an end. Coneled asks, can you provide some more details about how the engineering calculations for SS City of Rome were screwed up? It feels like going from steel to iron should have been manageable from a building, mathematics, or calculation standpoint. How did the engineers manage to mess that up? So exactly what caused, or what was the primary cause of the problems on the SS City of Rome is actually still a little bit of a matter of debate. I mean, fair enough, there's not a huge number of people who are debating it, but of the people who do discuss it, fundamentally there were two major problems. On launch, she had a severely underpowered and very bizarre power plant. So when she was put on trials, it turned out that the power plant just wasn't kicking out the horsepower that was actually needed. And obviously that was always going to make her somewhat slower, even if she had been built of steel entirely as was originally planned. Plus the fact that obviously the switch from steel to iron, without any change in overall dimensions, and she's quite a slim vessel for her size, meant that, well, iron is obviously weaker than steel, therefore you have to have more iron, therefore thicker structural elements. And so she's about 30% overweight compared to her original design specification. So you have a vessel that's massively overweight and significantly underpowered, and therefore is completely incapable of reaching her design speeds. Now, obviously, if you are 30% overweight, that is going to cause a lot of problems in terms of your speed, regardless of anything else. However, I think it should be noted that when she's taken in after a few years for a refit and they go in and go, okay, we are going to completely revise this engine and machinery layout because this is stupid, she actually gains around about 3 knots in speed, which is not an insubstantial amount of speed just by putting a slightly saner power plant in her. However, there are still restrictions on her deadweight capacity and it's taken her from being a very slow liner to an okay speed liner, but never the kind of really high speed they were looking for because of that additional weight caused by the use of iron instead of steel. I think the simple fact is that when the substitution was made, it was a case of these are the dimensions, this is the layout, this is what the ship is going to be, essentially. And now it's up to the engineers to ensure the thing doesn't collapse under its own weight using the materials provided. And if you've designed a ship in a certain way to be built out of steel and then you have to switch over to iron, well, it's just going to get heavier. Then they weren't allowed to go, okay, but if we change the hull form, maybe we'll make it wider or shorter, or change the curve of her lines and so on and so forth. Not allowed to do any of that. It's literally just a straight substitution. Well, it is going to be heavier and slower as a result. One way of getting around that would have been to go, okay, well, we're going to have a heavier hull, therefore we need to have a slightly larger, more powerful machinery plant. But they also weren't allowed to do that, on top of, as I said, having this really weird eccentric power plant that they put in the first place that was partly specified by the designers, partly specified by the actual line, the Inman line that had ordered her in the first place. So, yeah, while there were certainly engineering screw-ups that ended up with the ship the way she was, quite a lot of those were a result of basically being told, this is what you're going to do, and these are the materials you have to do it, have fun, and you just can't square that circle sometimes. David Pierce asks, the more I try and phrase this question, the more I think a pre-modern naval cartographic or surveying method video would be really cool. Yeah, it probably would be. A fantastic amount of research would need to be done for it. But anyway, the main question is, I was curious if sailors of the first millennium or prior used anything like maps when sailing. I know they tended to keep to the coastline. Did they have charts of coastal landmarks to work with, or was it mostly a function of experience? I'm also curious when and why the convention changed from ancient maps oriented with the east at the top of the page to the more modern practice of north as up. So the convention of maps using north instead of east is generally attributed to, roughly speaking, the 15th century. So there's a gradual rise in the use immediately before that of magnetic compasses, which of course point north, at which point, well, if your compass is pointing north, then it's somewhat easier to have a map that also points north, because then you can go, okay, well, this is what my compass says, and therefore mentally orienting what you're seeing and where you're going is considerably easier than having to rotate your map 90 degrees all the time. Also, there was a rediscovery of and translation of various ancient texts that used a northern projection and grid lines, and they thought, oh, this is cool, so we'll use this as well, essentially. There's a lot more to it than that, but briefly speaking, kind of the early Renaissance, I suppose. Now, going further back in time for sailors in, say, the first millennium, Roman times, etc., they had a mixture of methods. They had the ability to use, obviously, the stars and the sun to work out their direction of travel, approximately. There were general maps, but nothing you could use really for detailed navigation. So, maps such as existed at the time, and most ships wouldn't have copies, but you could consult copies, and so you would know from, say, a map that may be in Alexandria or Caesarea or Rome or Athens or whatever, and from your education, that, okay, well, this is roughly what, say, the Mediterranean looks like, and if we want to go from, I don't know, Alexandria to Rhodes, we know that this is roughly northwest, kind of north-northwest from where we are. So that's where we need to go, and we know there's this really big island that's in the way, which is a little inconvenient. So that will give you a general gist of roughly what direction you needed to go and what you might run into. But then the main gist of ancient navigation would be a combination of experience. So captains would obviously be like, okay, well, I have sailed these waters, this trade route, or these few trade routes for 15, 20, 30 years. I know how to do this. So it wasn't a case of, hello, Captain, I want to go to Mauritania today. And it's like, well, good luck, mate. We're in Antioch, and I ain't going there because I ain't ever sailed further west than Thessalonica. So go find someone else. Or I could take you to Thessalonica, and then you could find someone there who might take you further along. Or maybe we'll go to Corinth. That's always a fun place. And you might find someone who constantly sails from Corinth to Syracuse. And then in Syracuse, you might find someone who sails from there to Mauritania, and so on and so forth. But if you were perhaps of the more adventurous type, or you wanted to switch routes, or you just wanted to double-check your knowledge, there were also written guides that went by various names, obviously both translated into English now and Latin or Greek terms then. But essentially, these were kind of like how-tos. So much like if you put something in Google Maps these days and then print it out, and it goes, go 3 miles straight along, then turn left at this junction, and so on and so forth, you would have these written guides. So let's say if you were sailing from Rome, or Ostia technically, because Rome wasn't a seaport, and you wanted to, say, go to Corinth in Greece, then the guide would say, okay, well, first of all, obviously you have to start sailing south and a little bit east, and then it would say things like, well, if you're sailing in springtime, the winds are going to be like this, and if it's summer, the winds are going to be like that, and don't bother sailing in the winter because you will die. Otherwise, these are the primary wind directions in this area, and then as you progress, you'll see this landmark, and then you'll see that landmark. And then when you see this landmark, you want to bear out to sea because there's shoals and shallow water in this area. But when you see this other landmark, you want to stick quite close to the coastline because further out there are these really dangerous currents that will pull you in directions you don't want to go. And then you'll get to what's now the Straits of Messina, and here you want to go in this part of the straits because that part will get you wrecked, and that part is full of pirates, and the wind gives really weird things over there, and so on and so on and so forth. So you'd have wind directions, shallows, currents, headwinds, swirling winds, all sorts of environmental conditions described, as well as, if you're sailing in this area and you see the weather start to do this, you have good fortune and the gods have blessed you. If, however, you see the weather starting to do this, make for the nearest land as soon as possible because everything is about to go very badly wrong. And this can kind of give you a step-by-step all the way around until you reach your destination. Joshua Dworkin asks, do you think the Royal Navy would have been better off continuing to refine the BL-15-42 guns used on Hood and the Queen Elizabeths for subsequent battleship classes compared to the breech-loading 16-inch Mark I guns used on the Nelsons and the 14-inch Mark VII guns used on the King George V's? I realise this question relies on a lot of hindsight, but considering that the 15-inch 42 had demonstrated even better armour penetration than originally designed for, and it was a known quantity, it seems that it would be a better choice than branching out into a calibre the Royal Navy had no previous experience with, such as the Nelsons, or one that had only ever been used on one previous battleship, the 14-inch guns on Canada, which obviously wasn't originally of Royal Navy design. Prince of Wales may have been a much more effective design at Denmark Strait if she'd been packing 9 heavily refined 15-inch guns than her historically initially unreliable 14-inch ones. While not necessarily strictly refining the 15-inch 42, I think there certainly is a case to say that, especially in hindsight, and perhaps also at the time, the Royal Navy would have been better sticking to the 15-inch calibre. Now, it's understandable that they would want to go up to 18-inch and 16.5 or 16-inch with their early 1920s designs because that was the nature of naval arms races. Guns just kept getting bigger. But then when you get to the Washington Naval Treaty and people are looking to cap the naval gun size as well as various other things like ship displacement, I think when you end up with the Nelsons, there is a degree of, well, the Japanese have the Nagatos, the Americans have the Colorados, therefore we also need a 16-inch gun. Rather, I mean, there are other arguments about obviously broadside weight and armour penetration power, etc., etc. But there is a certain amount of we need to have a gun as big as everybody else's as well, because they look, as I've covered before, at the F2 and the F3, which are battle cruisers, at least officially, which are essentially, especially with F3, is, with a few minor changes here and there, essentially Nelson but faster, with 15-inch guns instead of 16-inch guns, fractionally less armour but considerably higher speed. But the amount of armour that she's got and the layout for F3 is such that if you took her specs and transposed them into the 1930s, apart from obviously the slight lack of anti-aircraft armament, or significant anti-aircraft armament, I should say, she'd essentially be a fast battleship. Her armour wouldn't disgrace her, neither would her speed nor her firepower. So I think if they'd gone with F3 from a purely cold, pragmatic point of view, then it might have actually worked out better for them. And F3 wouldn't have used the 15-inch 42. She would have used a new 15-inch gun, but one that could still obviously have used the existing 15-inch shells and some new ones. And it would have allowed unified caliber across the main part of the Royal Navy in the 1920s and the entirety of the Royal Navy in the early 1930s, because, of course, initially you had the Iron Dukes and Tiger around, but once they go and the 13.5-inch caliber goes with them, then, in theory, your new fleet would be Revenges, Queen Elizabeths, Renown Repulse, Hood, and the F3s, all with 15-inch guns, which then would have made an argument for, as we kind of saw that they initially considered King George V's with 3 triple 15-inch turrets, again of a new 15-inch gun design, it would have made for a much stronger argument in that case, because at that point, the British would have very extensive experience with 15-inch guns, a huge amount of commonality across the fleet, and then they could go, okay, well, you lot are designing with 16-inch guns, you've got 16-inch guns in the fleet, we've got 15-inch. We now have a very strong inertia to try and continue this caliber. And so in London too, when they're trying to downsize the size of naval guns, arguing for a reduction from 16-inch to 15-inch is going to be a lot more attractive to the Royal Navy. And hey, it's 1 less inch than they historically argued for, so there wouldn't be a huge amount of opposition, I think, from the Americans, or at least not as much as there was even to the 14-inch. And then, yeah, if the King George V's come in with 3 triple 15s, and everyone has 15-inch guns, and the F3s are, as fast as the King George V, just with a different gun layout, it overall probably would have worked out much better for the Royal Navy. Matt Blom asks, given your experience at the John W. Brown Steam School, did you find anything you learned particularly surprising or unexpected? I would say there are probably 3 things that I would list as surprising, unexpected, or not necessarily surprising or unexpected, but certainly gratifying in how obvious it was compared to what I would perhaps anticipate. So the things that would be surprising or unexpected for me, and bear in mind, obviously being a Liberty ship, she's, as you can see here, for power vertical triple expansion engine, were the lubrication system. And you can actually see elements of it here. So most of the brass piping that you can see, and these little brass receptacles, as in on the bottom right and the center right. Now, obviously, I knew that vertical triple expansion engines needed a lot of lubrication, but the system for applying lubrication to the main portions of the engine on a consistent basis turns out to be these various little sized brass receptacles that you top up with oil and then have a kind of like a greedy cupped siphon system in them. And the way that you control the rate and therefore the amount of oil that is then dripped down through the pipework onto the various bits and pieces that need lubrication is simply a soaked worsted rag or thread that soaks up the oil and via capillary action takes it up and over and down the pipe, and obviously when it reaches the end it drips off. And literally, to control the amount of flow, you just adjust how much of it is hanging over into the pipe compared to how much of it is soaking in the oil and how many of them. It's literally a very direct physical control method. It's like, oh, we're getting too much oil? Okay, just pull that slightly. And that's it. It's just relying on simple physics to control the oil flow. And, I mean, it's fantastic. It's a system that works in a very basic way. You can teach almost anyone how to do it in a few minutes and how it works. And it's not going, it can't break down. There's no mechanical component to it. Very, very reliable. But, yeah, absolutely fascinating. The other thing that was unexpected was it rains in vertical triple expansion steam engine room. And I've said before in various videos that yes, it was hot, it was humid, there was oil and water and steam everywhere. And yes, there was once the engine started to get fired up. However, the bit that I didn't anticipate, and in hindsight I probably should have done, was the fact that a lot of the water that you end up being splashed on you isn't actually directly from the engines, but when steam is coming out from various bits of the engine and the auxiliary machinery and so on and so forth, that steam rises in the engine room. It then hits the much colder upper portions of the engine room, including the ceiling and so forth, and then it condenses, and then it falls back down on you. So it literally rains while the engine is going. It's a fairly pleasant rain, to be honest, because this is steam that has just rapidly condensed and dropped down, so the water is pretty warm. It's not unpleasant. But it is very bizarre to have your own little microclimate forming very rapidly as soon as the engine kicks off. The other thing which I knew was present, but I was, at least for me as an engineer, extremely gratified to see just how extensive it was the near complete lack of any kind of modern concession to health and safety in the original design of the ship. There are a few modern signs and so forth for liability purposes, but the way that ship was laid out shows what I, again, as an engineer, appreciate as a practical approach to safety. We're not going to put 15% extra weight into this thing so that every single portion of this machinery is guarded, triple locked, and so forth, so that even the most mouth-breathing idiot could stumble through the engine room half drunk at night and not hurt themselves. Now, that engine room can and will kill you in a number of very inventive and gruesome ways, or at least badly maim you, if you don't respect it. But it's not that difficult to respect it. Firstly, it's a massive engine, and a set of massive boilers. It's fairly obvious that it can and will tear you to shreds if it wants to. And, well, there's the electrical generation system there as well, which will fry you. But it takes a handful of words to explain why this is dangerous and therefore why you should keep away from it. So here is the propeller shaft. If you get yourself wrapped in the propeller shaft, it will turn you into a fine mince, or possibly roll you out like pastry. Solution: don't touch the propeller shaft. You don't have to go near it. The walkway does actually have a guardrail, so there is no excuse for you getting yourself mangled in the propeller shaft other than you're an idiot and you have removed yourself from the gene pool. Similarly, with the actual, the cylinders and the shafts, the crankshafts, big heavy metal object moving. Again, there is a small safety rail so that you don't just fall when the ship pitches or rolls. Don't jump in the gigantic engine. Cool, we don't die. Boilers, don't climb in the boiler room. Or no, don't climb in the boiler itself. Yeah, cool, now we don't burn to death. Fantastic. The electricity board, this is a giant array of knife switches. This has a lot of live current running through it. If you touch it, you will die. Solution: don't touch the board. Again, there is a small guardrail, so that there is some protection against unintentional touching of the things that will otherwise kill you. Because, as I said, ships pitch and roll, and you might get thrown off balance and so forth. And so, if you just don't go in the bits where there's obviously some kind of basic safety protection, you won't get horribly injured. If you are an idiot and you reach past those areas, or you jump over those areas and so forth, then it will tear you to pieces. This is fine, because frankly, if you did that, you were probably too dumb to live anyway, in my opinion. It's just like, you don't need to insulate the entire board as long as you just stay away from it, like the sign says, and like the guardrail suggests. It's very, very simple. It's essentially the seagoing equivalent of, here is a sign on a fence that surrounds a field that says, "Caution, dangerous bull inside field." You do not go into field, you do not get trampled to death by the bull. Everybody is happy. If you are stupid and you climb the fence and ignore the sign and try and antagonize the bull and it tramples you into the ground, that's kind of your own fault. No one is really to blame apart from yourself. No real additional safety measures practically should have been taken. You are responsible for your own demise. Whereas today, although obviously some health and safety regulations that have been brought in are reasonable, an awful lot of health and safety regulations these days are essentially the equivalent of sticking pool noodles on the horns of the bull and, I don't know, somehow, I guess, attaching a bunch of helium balloons so it can only totter around at like 2 miles an hour and so forth, purely on the basis of, well, some people are so dumb they will climb the fence and ignore the sign and go into the field, therefore we have to make the bull safe for everybody to just go around and antagonize. And then, I don't know, get kicked to death or just sat on or something, and people will still whine and moan and complain. It's like that's when things have really gone a bit too far. Greg M. asks, how can we learn more about Admiral Philip Vian without spending over $300 for a used copy of his memoir? I believe you can get a copy of his service record from the UK National Archives, which would be obviously quite interesting. But if you want direct information about him, as opposed to obviously covering various campaigns that he was in, and obviously gets mentioned incidentally in them, I think at this stage, probably the best thing would be to look at some of... There's been a number of books published about key British admirals of the 20th century, or key British admirals generally, and a number of those will have chapters on Vian, although obviously it's usually best to check in advance which particular books do cover him, because obviously some books will, some books won't. Other than that, I am actually, ironically enough, given that you asked this particular question, I am currently engaged in a search trying to hunt down contact details for his descendants, because he has at least grandchildren still around, and I'm trying to find a way to write to them, because his memoir was published in 1960 and then he obviously died in 1968, it is still obviously protected by copyright until the late 2030s, so I would like to get in contact with them to arrange some kind of license deal to republish said memoir, perhaps with some fancy illustrations and pictures and a few additional bits and pieces here and there. So yeah, working on that. Let's see if I can find some contact details, and then obviously if they'll respond. Ian Carr asks, please can you comment on the submarines resupplying Malta in World War II? What time period was involved? What boats were used? What modifications were used to increase capacity? What did they carry? And how much did they contribute to the survival of Malta? So this was done in terms of several years, starting in 1940 and through to basically 43 at various stages. In terms of the boats being used, the vast majority were the big mine layers, simply because they had a lot of space and they were available. And because they had been designed for extremely long-distance operations, it meant that you could put stuff, particularly fuel, as you'll see in a minute, into their fuel tanks. I know that sounds silly, but as opposed to oil fuel, you could say, okay, because we're only going a short distance, we'll only fill some of the fuel tanks with oil fuel, we'll fill other fuel tanks with aviation fuel, kerosene, stuff like that, which can then be pumped out when they get to Malta and used there. And there were some modifications as time went on, although not that many, because the boat still had active duties to fulfill. They did contribute quite heavily to the survival of Malta, but with very specific items being delivered. So, unfortunately, known as the magic carpet service, which also means that, when you're looking for information on it, it gets massively overshadowed by the post-war Operation Magic Carpet to get everybody home. One reference work says that during July 1941, as a snapshot, the Magic Carpet Service conveyed to Malta 126 passengers, 84,280 gallons of petrol, 83,340 gallons of kerosene, 12 tons of mail, 30 tons of general stores, and 6 tons of munitions, including torpedoes for submarines and aircraft operating from the island, as in aerial torpedoes. But to give you some idea of kind of how it started and how it went on, here's some excerpts from interview done with the captain of HMS Rockwell, which was one of the mine-laying subs and the only one that actually survived. So he says, basically because of the Axis blockade, means had to be found of getting in the most vital supplies, and the most vital supplies were seen to be aviation fuel for the aircraft based in Malta. And so it was decided during this period, when it was hardly possible to run convoys from either end of the Mediterranean into Malta, that submarines were almost the only way in which supplies could be got in. The quantities which any one submarine could bring in were very small indeed compared to the requirements, but by using several submarines from both ends of the Mediterranean, a certain amount could be done. So the very first duties which Rockwell was employed on after I took over was taking supplies to Malta. To begin with, this was done in a very primitive fashion. We simply filled the mine casing with 4-gallon cans of petrol, and they were fixed in place with wooden battens. They would move about and were likely to burst under sea pressure. We also used to disembark a proportion of our fuel so that the fuel tanks could then be filled with aviation spirit. And so this was the first thing we did. We went off with this petrol, a certain amount of dry stores which could be carried inside, and some passengers always. Because we couldn't go on the surface during the day, would take the best part of a week to get from Alexandria to Malta. I remember on one occasion when we had a whole interior deck, built through the length of the submarine made out of cases of dehydrated cabbage. And we had some amusement thinking of what would happen to us inside the submarine if water got into the dehydrated cabbage, which I suppose might perhaps have swelled up to leave us with no room at all to move around. It only took a small amount of conversion for Rockwell to become a store carrier capable of carrying over 200 tons of supplies. Early in May 1941, Rockwell was taken off patrol for special duty, and we lay for 3 weeks in Alexandria while dockyard workmen swarmed through the passageways, stripping out all non-essential equipment. Then, on the 3rd of June, we loaded a cargo that reflected Malta's most pressing needs. As well as 2 officers and 21 ratings as passengers, we carried 1,478 cans of aviation spirit, as well as 15 tons in bulk in the tanks, 48 tons of kerosene, medical stores, wire, and 147 bags of mail. On another run, we carried 21 passengers, 11,700 gallons of kerosene, 50 tons of aviation spirit in bulk and 14 tons in cans, 2 U-class submarine propellers, 2 tons of army clothing, fire hoses, foamite refills, and 90 bags of mail. So you can see from that little excerpt how important these submarine runs were, because while obviously getting vast bulk freighters and tankers in would help sustain the population as a whole, it was very often these small, slightly more secure runs by supply subs that kept particularly the military side of Malta going. And obviously, without the aircraft based in Malta and the various other bits and pieces that they were taking, like the foamite refills for carriers and other ships that were in Drydock there, then Malta couldn't have meaningfully resisted the Axis attacks, which, them holding out is what allowed the supply convoys to get there in the first place. DM Phoenix asks, can you briefly talk about the final days and hours of Bismarck, in particular from the viewpoint of a typical sailor on board? I had read that the officers opened up all of the ship's stores to the men, allowing them to take whatever they wanted. This seems like a rather fatalistic move that might have led to a breakdown in discipline. Did every man know the context of their situation and what was coming? Was discipline maintained to the end, or was there talk of surrender and abandoning the ship before the Royal Navy arrived? There are certainly some accounts that suggest that towards the end of the voyage, the crew were told you can take whatever you want from the ship's stores, because a lot of the officers felt they were pretty much doomed. Although exactly when that occurs seems to vary slightly by account. Every one of the accounts agrees that it was after the rudder was disabled by the swordfish strikes. So it definitely wasn't before that. But whether it was also before the night action with the tribal class and Piron, or the following morning when it was clear that this was going to be their last day afloat, that's where the accounts vary slightly. And also, some sailors just don't seem to have taken particular advantage of it, whereas others did. But the general shift of mood as a result of the announcement does seem to have been somewhat negative. So I think the idea that the officers were trying to sort of implement was that, well, get everybody fed. We're not going to use all these stores. The ship's only going to be afloat for 24 to 48 hours from now, so we might as well use up all these stores, get everyone fed, get everyone energized, a little bit, maybe a little bit buzzed, and hopefully that will help. However, it does seem to have dampened morale in a number of sailors and a number, according to the survivors' accounts, a number of departments. Although, as I said, not everybody partook quite as enthusiastically, and generally speaking, once push came to shove, the crew did do their duty and fight back until it wasn't really possible to do so. And everyone pretty much knew that their number was up. You can't conceal something like the pitch of the ship because of the big holes and flooding in the bow. You can't conceal the fact you're lurching around at low speed when the rudder's been jammed. These are not things you can keep from the ship's crew. And while there was some hope that you might make it under air cover or U-boat cover and so forth, everyone was pretty aware, especially after the night action by the destroyers that kept them up most of the night, that that was a very much an optimistic hope. However, there doesn't seem to have been any real talk of surrender or abandoning the ship. Apart from anything, abandoning the ship in the middle of the Atlantic would have been a supremely terrible idea in terms of survival, and even if you survived and made it back to Nazi-occupied Europe, you would almost certainly be shot as a traitor, and they had too much pride in their ship to surrender it without a fight. Gallias of Martinengo asks, I've seen the Ottoman Navy being mentioned as the third largest fleet in existence in the 1870s, I guess perhaps by total tonnage. But then when war with Russia comes in 1877, the fleet proves completely useless against the Russian Black Sea Squadron, apparently with some capital ships not even leaving the Bosporus due to poor state of maintenance and lack of trained crew. Why would an on-paper top-tier navy then completely fail in such a war? Was it because of political and cultural reasons, or the transition to steam and steel, or something else? Well, the main problem with the Ottoman fleet was that it had been ordered and built by Sultan Abdulaziz on the basis that the Ottoman Empire he wanted would have to be very strong, and that involved having a strong navy. However, he also appeared to have partially decided that, as I mentioned in another video, finances were a thing that happened to other people. So having essentially mortgaged most of the Ottoman Empire to the hilt to pay for this big ironclad fleet, as you can see here, it then turned out there wasn't the continuing money to actually run said fleet. So as the ships were built, they'd sail around a bit for their first year of service and then go into extended reserve. So for most of the 1870s, although the Ottomans had a large ironclad fleet on paper, for 80-90% of the year, they were just sitting around doing not a lot. And then in the summer, they'd be activated to do a short voyage, which was mostly just to make sure the engine still worked. But other than that, training mostly consisted of, here's the test and training manuals, read them, so you know what to do if we actually ever do end up using these ships. So by the time the 1877 war with Russia broke out, firstly, by the point the war with Russia itself was declared, the Ottomans had been fighting extensive land campaigns against various rebellions for several years, so that's where most of their military attention and funding had been focused. And then once full-on war breaks out, obviously the ships aren't particularly experienced, the crews aren't particularly skilled. They do try and do their best. As you mentioned, some of the ships stay around in essentially to defend the capital. Others are found off the mouth of the Danube and transporting troops around. They're doing some work, but they just do not have the training or the experience to form a meaningful battle fleet to try and seek an engagement with the Russians. And a huge amount of this war is being conducted as a straight-up land campaign between Russia and the Ottomans, who obviously share a land border. And apart from river operations with smaller vessels, there's not a huge amount that the Ottoman fleet could do at that stage. The only real way they could impact major Russian operations at that point would be unified battle fleet operations to attack Russian positions and supply lines further north and east in the Black Sea, but they just weren't in the shape to do that. Robert Henry Ilston asks, how much did private companies' contracts contribute to naval technological development by acting as test beds, whether intentional or not, before the technology could then be formally adopted by a national navy? In general, it was far more common for private companies through various methods to end up unintentionally or intentionally contributing to naval technology earlier in naval history than later. So a short list of examples, I guess. For example, the carronade originally developed as a lightweight, cheap method of allowing merchant ships to defend themselves with a decent degree of firepower. Then obviously ported over with great success to the Royal Navy. And then a little bit later on, Nemesis is the first British-built iron-hulled warship, obviously not built for the Royal Navy, built for the the Honourable East India Company. And she proves a lot of the concepts around an iron warship being a worthwhile investment, although as it turns out, for the Royal Navy itself, iron warships are not really worth it until armoured iron warships are developed considerably later. There's also a huge amount of civilian development going around in testing various kinds of steam engine and then enhancing on it in the 19th century, and the Royal Navy is obviously then able to go, oh, well, we know that works, so we'll try that for warship applications. The Bessemer process to generate large amounts of steel at all, and then various improvements that the French make in their steel production process, both of which are not initially military efforts, not really directed at ship construction, but just generally directed at the need for steel in the commercial market. And obviously both of those factor massively into the shift over first to compound armour, then to steel armour, and also to steel use in warship hulls generally. But as you get towards the latter part of the 19th century, military and civilian technologies have diverged enough that there are more limited ways in which civilian tech is helping. So obviously things like sonar, technically there are early versions of underwater listening devices which you could say are the ancestors of sonar, which are civilian applications, but the specific kind of use of underwater ping and receive to measure depth and distance to submerged objects is mostly a military development, although, as I say, based on certain civilian technologies. And similarly with turbines, for example, the Royal Navy introduces its first turbine-powered destroyer a couple of years before the first turbine-powered merchant ship goes to sea. And of course, civilians have no real need for massive optical fire control systems and such like. So when you move into the 20th century, outside of a few random things like talk radio and so forth, it's pretty much military technology being developed by the military or military firms for the military. The Weeaboo Terminator asks, there's a bit of a factoid going around that the Japanese destroyer Ayanami was referred to as a rampaging Black Panther during the Second Battle of Guadalcanal due to its skillful use of night cover. How much truth is there to this? I would be hesitant in saying that it has a strong basis in fact. I certainly couldn't find anything in any of the reference works that I have on Ayanami in print form that this was a nickname, and pretty much most, if not all, of the mentions of a nickname for her in online, at least, as either Black Panther or occasionally Demon of Solomon, all seem to either be uncited entries on Wikipedia, which basically means don't even bother referring to it, because if it's uncited on Wikipedia, then good luck. That's probably just someone's put it in for fun. And of all places, Azure Lane, the mobile game, there doesn't seem to be anything cited in particularly historical works. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, I can't really see any justification for her being called that because of her actions during the Second Battle of Guadalcanal. I mean, sure, she's part of the force that lays into and lays waste to the US destroyer force, but she is also then counter-batteried and sunk, well, critically damaged by Washington and then sunk by Uranami once the survivors have been taken off. So, yeah, she accomplished some cunning maneuvers and then got herself killed, so that's not really something to particularly gain a nickname over, especially the fact that it would have to be a nickname someone came up with in the middle of the action, because, as I say, shortly thereafter she was hit and set on fire. So, I struggle to believe that. I could potentially see some argument for her getting the Black Panther nickname, because not only does that actually have a short form Japanese word associated with it that is plausible, but also she did complete something like half a dozen successful transport runs to Guadalcanal prior to her involvement in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, And I can potentially see the fact that she completed that many successful runs undamaged, that potentially earning her the nickname Black Panther, because, well, she's obviously very sneaky for being able to do that. But again, although that is perhaps the more plausible of the two nicknames, I still can't, at least for my part, find any written evidence for it. If other people have seen written evidence for it, perhaps in Japanese sources or something like that, feel free to let us know in the comments below. I'd be interested to know. Tankadromis asks, how much armour could the Invincibles and Indefatigables have gained if they were designed with 6 guns on the centreline, practical broadside staying the same in most cases, and would there be any disadvantage to this change? Well, I think part of it is going to depend on where you put the centreline turret. So on the Invincibles, it's actually slightly easier because they have 2 forward boiler rooms and then this slightly oblong space where various compartments, including the magazines for the P and Q turrets, are, and then the aft boiler room. So you could, in theory, go, okay, well, we're just going to have the one in the middle and save some wing space. Maybe make the ship faster by putting some machinery there instead, or possibly actually slimming the ship down slightly, and obviously using some of that space maybe with a boiler on either side. You need a fair bit of refrigeration, but it could be done, and that would allow you to maintain overall speed, or perhaps slightly increase it still and trim the other boilers' rooms down slightly. But there's all sorts of things you could do there. With the Indefatigables, as you can see here, it's a slightly different problem because you've got boiler room, P turret, boiler room, Q turret, boiler room. So rearranging all of that, you'd basically have to rearrange the centerline layout considerably more, either shoving that center boiler room fore or aft to fit the third turret in there. The thing is, I don't think you would get a forward super firing pair, certainly not on the Invincibles, because of the issues with the sighting hoods and so forth, and having to move the entire superstructure and forward boiler room considerably aft. You could perhaps more realistically get a super firing pair aft, because that only involves cutting down some of the aft superstructure and moving that slightly forward, and that would be somewhat easier to do. And the general idea would be, well, these ships are chasing anyway, so as long as you give it the super firing turret a decent arc to aim forward, the thinking of the time is very unlikely to be firing directly aft over the aft turret, so that's fine. Although obviously a centerline turret would probably have even better forward arcs, especially if you positioned it more akin to where Q turret is than P, but obviously very much restricted rear arcs. So the various turret positions would make a considerable difference as to how effective the ship is going to be in terms of its actual mission. But broadly speaking, like you point out, most of the time the ships practically were only ever using 6 guns anyway, so whether it's a super firing forward pair, super firing aft pair, or an amidships turret, you're probably going to have basically the same practical broadside. Although, obviously, for engagements directly to port or starboard or near enough, you are technically losing that 8-gun ability. Now, very crudely speaking, by removing that 4th turret, you're saving about 600 tons. If you look at the weight of the turret and the guns on their own, you would probably be saving more than that. There is a general rule that for every ton of additional equipment you add to a ship, you're adding 2 tons to structural weight. But how that works when you're taking off equipment and not really substantially altering the structure all that much, while it would be much more generous, let's say we can guarantee that you're saving about 600 tons or so. Now, let's use the Invincibles for our case example. The Invincibles armour belt is about 11 foot tall, and the 6-inch section of it runs about 330 feet long. So if we multiply 330 by 22, because of course the belt armour is on both sides, that gives us a total surface area of Invincible's belt armour of 7,260 square feet. And 1 inch of steel weighs about 40.8 pounds or about 18.5 kilos per square foot. So a 1 inch thick plate of steel that is 1 foot by 1 foot will weigh 18.5 kilos. So if we multiply 18.5, which is our kilos per square foot per inch, by 7,260, which is our total square footage of armour. That gives us, once we've divided through by 1,000 to get tons, that it would cost 134.3 tons to upgrade the armour belt of the Invincibles by 1 inch of thickness, which would then mean that for the weight, the 600 tons weight saving of removing one of the turrets, we could technically add just a fraction under 4.5 inches to Invincible's belt, which would make it about 10.5 inches thick. With the Indefatigables, the gains would be slightly less because you're saving about the same amount of weight, but you're covering a longer portion of armour, and a portion of Indefatigable's main belt is only 4 inches thick, so maybe only 9 inches overall on that. But yeah, you could make them substantially better protected. Maximus Tillman IV asks, in paleontology, the Stegosaurus's tail was actually named the Thagomizer after a cartoon from The Far Side, which pictured the vicious tail spikes that would make any dinosaur, regardless of size, think twice or perhaps more before engaging it. What ship would you characterize as the Thagomizer? Maybe Shimakaze? I think it would actually be very difficult to classify any early 20th century ship in such a manner, simply because for the bulk of the early 20th century, it very much was a game of rock, paper, scissors. So certainly in, for example, World War II, any ship that is particularly strong in one department, let's say weaponry, can be countered by various things. So with Shimakaze, for instance, yes, if you're a surface vessel, you don't want to get particularly close to her at all because of all the torpedoes. However, there are a number of other options to deal with Shimakaze, even if you account for the fact that she has long lances. Aircraft carriers, for example, are not going to be particularly threatened by Shimakaze unless she's right up close. They'll just launch a big airstrike, and after all, she is still just a destroyer. And even the bigger cruisers, as well as capital ships, yeah, they don't want her to get too close, much in the same way that as a T-Rex, you wouldn't want a Raptor getting right up close to your ankles, but you can just hit her from long range and watch her go kaboom, which would keep you safe. Conversely, if you go back to World War I, obviously aircraft aren't so much of a threat, but while gun ranges are somewhat lower, torpedo ranges are lower still. So, there is, for example, with destroyers and torpedo boats, yes, heavier ships can engage them at longer range, but if they get into closer range, then the torpedoes are a big problem. There are secondary batteries of somewhat limited effectiveness, but of course destroyers show up in larger numbers, so this is why even the biggest and scariest battleships of World War II didn't really ever go anywhere without escorts. So I think if you want a ship that you could call the Thagomizer, i.e. anyone and anything that looks at it is going, maybe I want to be somewhere else today, I think you have to go back to pre-torpedo warfare, which means basically either early ironclads, and you could then make an argument for something like Warrior or Gloire right at the beginning of their service, because they are almost untouchable by practically anything else on the seas, and they very much can touch you. But that's I think maybe a little unfair, because of course that's a whole new evolution of naval technology. So if you were looking for ships that are part of an existing naval ecosystem, if you like, I would say probably you're looking at the late stage first rates, so your late 1700s and early to mid 1800s first rates, like Britannia here, because they're massive 3-decker, or in the case of the Spanish 4-decker, things, incredibly heavily armed, and especially as you get into the sort of 120, 130, 140 gun plus first rates, they just so massively outgun anything that isn't them. And once they start wielding shell guns and stuff, can also dish out ridiculous amounts of destructive firepower that, any number of brigs, sloops, frigates, etc., seeing one of these things is just going to go, no, because the minute I get in range, I'm just going to die horribly, which is kind of what most frigates acknowledged with ships of the line earlier on. But I think the effect of shell gun technology and increasing ship size just kind of made that even more so in the first half of the 19th century. And whereas a first-rate ship of the line against a like vessel in the 18th and early 19th century, like, say, at Trafalgar with Santa Anna versus Royal Sovereign, would be a vicious, prolonged duel. I think a ship-of-the-line fight in the 1830s, 1840s between two first-rates would have been a lot shorter, a lot more violent, and a lot more destructive. And so, yeah, something like Britannia or Windsor Castle or something like that would be the Thagomizer of ships. Not shaped for sportive tricks asks, Drac, French battleships from the Terrible class of the 1870s onwards all seem to display an aversion to having a forecastle worth the name, and this trend seems to continue right up until the rather gorgeous Strasbourgs. To the amateur eye, this looks like it would hinder seakeeping, especially in heavy weather. Was there a good design reason for this allergy, or was it just a case of the French have got to be French? So there's three kinds of stages to this, broadly speaking. You've got up until the advent of steel vessels, so from the Terrible class up until the first properly steel French battleships. Yeah, there isn't a forecastle, but to be honest, virtually no one has a real forecastle of any description at that point, because freeboards as a whole are pretty darn low because of the massive thickness of iron and later compound armour that's needed to protect the ships. Once you get to steel vessels and you can have a decent forecastle and a high freeboard, the French, generally speaking, take a slightly different approach to things. So here's Massena, and this is probably a good example, a very good example of showing it visually, because in this case she's riding pretty light, and you can see what looks to be a gargantuan ram bow out front. Now, yes, in some of the vessels this was actually a ram bow, as well as the more general thing, which you also see very much on French armoured cruisers of this period, which was essentially an attempt to cheat hydrodynamics. Because if you extend the entire ship's bow out to the extreme end, that adds weight. If you have weight, that means you need more propulsion and so forth, and everything spirals upwards. Whereas the French had the cunning idea of, okay, well, if we stick the ship's bow as far as hydrodynamic concerns are concerned, so where the ship actually starts to split and part the water, if that is really, really far out front, like you can see here, then our waterline length, which then works with your beam to determine your length to beam ratio and therefore your efficiency for moving at speed, that is good. But then we massively slope it back very quickly, and we have a very foreshortened forecastle, and then all the weight that would have been there isn't there, so we've saved a bunch of weight, which means we can go even faster, or we can go for the same speed on even less power, which for a navy that was very constrained by infrastructure size at that point, dry docks and so forth, was actually quite important. And the extent of this bow varies depending on the design, but some designs where you look at most of the pictures and you think, that looks fairly reasonable, look at the plans and you realise, oh, there is a really big underwater bow hiding down there. It's just this particular picture, Massena happens to show off a good portion of that. But as I said, this does vary and is tending to die away once you get to the very last French pre-dreadnoughts. Then, of course, the Dantons, the semi-dreadnoughts. Then you get to Courbet and Britannia classes, and yeah, they don't have it at all. They do have a relatively decent freeboard, but I can see what you mean in terms of they don't really have a huge amount of flair or a rake. It's just a very straight stem bow that just, water will probably come over relatively easily. But you also have to remember that up until and including the Britannia class, French battleships, generally speaking, with the odd exception of the Dantons, which for semi-dreadnoughts were pretty quick, were not exactly speed demons. The Courbets and the Britannias were somewhat slower than your average dreadnoughts of their periods. And so, yes, that forecastle isn't the best for seakeeping, but if you're only going at about 20 knots, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. They do have enough freeboard, at least in calmer conditions, to not take water green over the bow continuously. And of course, that kind of bow tends to be a little bit more buoyant than some, so it's not going to pitch quite as violently. But then, of course, when they get to Dunkirk and Strasbourg, they're faced with the issue of, well, we are actually now going to move at an appreciable speed, and, well, yeah, at that point you kind of do need a properly raked and flared bow, because otherwise you are going to just be consistently throwing water over your bow guns, which is not a good thing. John McCarthy asks, after the Battle of Jutland, the British modified their armour-piercing shells to improve their ability to survive the initial impact with their targets. What flaws were found in the older shells, and what changes were made to the newer ones? Essentially, the flaws could be grouped under three broad categories. There were a few other things, but the three main problems were, firstly, the explosive that was being used at the time, lyddite, was far, far, far too sensitive. Because obviously with an armour-piercing shell, you want the shell to hit, the fuse activates as a result of that, but you want to delay while the shell is going through the armour, and then the fuse goes off, which makes your explosive go off, which makes the shell explode, and thus does damage to the bit that's behind the armour. The problem they discovered was that essentially lyddite was so sensitive that it would just detonate itself on contact or very nearly after contact if it was subjected to any kind of significant shock, regardless of whether or not the fuse had gone off. And that meant that unless you happened to get a very perpendicular style shot, so it started penetrating very quickly, and we're talking about in the fractions of a second here, you'd end up with, near as much as makes no difference, a surface detonation or a very near surface detonation, which obviously doesn't help very much. And that whole near perpendicular thing kind of dominates the other two problems, which were the fuses and the shell bodies. So they also found that the shell bodies could, to a certain degree, penetrate, assuming that their warhead didn't, if you call it a warhead, the main explosive charge, assuming that didn't just go off of its own volition, the shell bodies and the armour-piercing caps could penetrate armour relatively well at a near enough perpendicular angle. Doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 90 degrees, but 10, 15, maybe pushing up to 20 degrees off angle. But the minute you got into that kind of 20 degree plus off angle region, the shell body didn't have enough horizontal strength, so it would break up. At which point, even if the lyddite inside hadn't gone off of its own accord and the fuse was working properly, well, at that point you have a loose collection of explosive metal fragments and a fuse travelling along the profile of the enemy ship instead of into the enemy ship, which just gives you a low-order explosion. And then finally, the fuses themselves, as I covered in a video a while back, the British had, for various reasons, been importing Krupp fuses. Then, of course, as the Anglo-German naval arms race heated up in the 1900s, the first decade, that is, of the 20th century, the Krupp company, for obvious reasons, stopped selling their latest and greatest fuses to Britain, which then meant that British fuse makers, who'd essentially been kind of left in the dust for a generation or two of fuse technology, now had to catch up, and obviously Krupp was continuing to make advances, and this was exactly the period when longer-range gunnery was coming in, and therefore the instant angle of a shell hit was getting larger. And so, by the 1910s, you had British fuses which were sort of mildly upgraded copies of early 1900s Krupp fuses, as well as some developments of their own, but they would function again at a mostly perpendicular angle, relatively reliably, but they had problems with horizontal forces acting on them in the event of a more oblique hit. And so when you get to the Green Boy shells, you see a complete redevelopment of the AP cap, the dimensions and shape of the shell body itself, new fuses, and a switch over from lyddite to shellite, which you can see here on this shell. And all of that collectively corrected pretty much all the major problems that British AP shells suffered. And the thing is, because of the nature of the varying circumstances of each impact, and of course production quality of each kind of shell, these are general guidelines, because you can find examples, even just in Jutland, for example, of a shell hitting at a pretty much dead-on perpendicular angle, which should be the ideal circumstance for a British shell, and just immediately detonating on contact, like a high explosive shell just without so much high explosive, which is obviously pretty poor performance. That case almost certainly is going to be the Lyddite inside, just going, hey, I've been hit by something, kaboom! Conversely, there are some other hits, like one I think on Der Flinger, which come in at a fairly steep incident angle, and theoretically, by everything I've just said, that shell should have failed in one of the three ways, but it didn't. It actually did its job, punched through heavy armour, and then goes and detonates inside the ship. Because, as I said, all these variables add up to very different outcomes every time a shell is fired. So everything I was just talking about is kind of a general rule, but there are outliers on either side. Whereas once you've got the green boys, the general rule would be it actually penetrates, and the outliers would be it fails. GFDX asks, there are many original turret setups, from actually built, like Agincourt's 7-turret farm, to designed, like the G3's sort of all forwards. What are some of your favourite original turret setups, even if only in design form? Well, I think it's a bit of an open secret at this point that I am greatly in favour of all-forward designs. Now, yes, of course, there are reasons why most navies dropped all-forward designs in the 1930s, but from a purely engineering efficiency standpoint, the all-forward design is just really, really good. And other concerns about, rear firing arcs and stuff, well, you shouldn't need them. You shouldn't need rear firing arcs. You should be attacking your enemy. Now, there is, admittedly, a small issue of if all your guns are concentrated right up forward, then one good hit in that area could potentially knock out your entire main armament. Admittedly, yeah, I'll give you that much. But personally, I think the benefits of the all-forward design outweigh the drawbacks, at least if you design the ship with some of those penalties in mind and address them. I mean, that's why I like the Richelieus, among other things. And the Richelieus aren't a half-bad design. They are some of the best design-fast battleships that are at least somewhat treaty compliant. Obviously, their secondary battery is not a huge amount to write home about because they don't really work properly, but the actual fundamental design isn't half bad. I do, as I've said before, have some issues with the spacing of Richelieu's turrets because that doesn't allow you to take up the full benefit of the all-forward armament in terms of efficiency, but that is what it is. And the other alternative all-forward layout I quite like, because obviously with the Richelieus you've got all your guns able to fire across pretty much your entire frontal arcs, and a similar design is, although we're using triples instead of quadruples, and therefore perhaps offering a little bit more survivability plus one extra gun, is the layout that was planned for the F3 battlecruisers, which, as you can hopefully work out here, you've got a forward turret, and then your second turret at the same level as the forward turret, and then the third turret superfires over the second. Now, I'll grant you that doesn't give you all guns all ahead the way that Richelieu's two quads do, because of course the second turret, if it was firing dead ahead, would fire into the back of the first turret. But in this layout, obviously your first and third turrets can fire on all arcs ahead and around, and the second turret, assuming that you're engaging at a somewhat decentish long range, can fire over the first turret. So you do have a degree of that all-forward firepower. Whereas with the way the Nelsons do it, although B turret there is the one that's elevated to give you the greatest rearward firing arcs, it does mean that in the sort of the forward arc of things, you can only ever fire A and B turrets, because the third turret, it can't fire over B turret because B turret is super firing over it. So yeah, generally speaking, my favourite original turret setups are all forward ones that allow either your entire battery to fire on all your forward and broadside arcs, or at least a good chunk of those likely arcs and engagement ranges. Glenn Riccafrente asks, what are your candidates for deadliest individual ships in history in terms of the destruction that each one caused to its enemies? I think it's a difficult one to quantify without specific criteria to fulfill. Because, for example, if you were looking at total damage caused to enemies, that's going to obviously favour ships that survive for a very long time. Because obviously over time, especially in periods of lots of warfare, they can capture or destroy a lot of enemy shipping, even if their individual impact in any given war might be relatively low. If they're in service for 40, 50, 60 years, then obviously that has time to accumulate. Conversely, you could also look at impact on the enemy. So, for example, if somebody has a navy that only consists of 4 ships, and one of your vessels shows up and sinks or captures 3 of them, you've destroyed 75% of your opponent's navy. That is very deadly, but if another ship goes out and, say, sinks and captures 6 ships, it has sunk or captured twice as many as the first vessel, but if it's the 6th vessel capture or destroying ship has done so against an enemy that has 600 ships in their navy, then the impact of that vessel is obviously considerably less than the one that only sank or captured 3. You could also go by tonnage, but at that point it's almost certainly just going to be won by a submarine in World War II, because obviously most submarines didn't even tip the scale at 1,000 tons, and even the big ones were only less than 2,000 for the most part. And yet, something like, say, Archerfish, when it sinks Shinano, is immediately making back multiple times its own displacement. So if you go in terms of displacement of ship versus displacement of enemy tonnage sunk, a U-boat or something like that is going to take the cake by a long way. So potentially another criteria, and the one I'm going to use for this question, would be number of enemy ships damaged or destroyed either directly or in large part thanks to its efforts in a relatively short period of time, kind of a roaring rampage type scenario. And in that case, 2 very strong candidates would either be Drake's Revenge, a race-built galleon, particularly for its last stand, which is relatively famous, where it takes on dozens of Spanish ships, is eventually captured, but between its own actions directly against Spanish ships, killing the boarding crews and shooting them up where they're at close range, and then the poor condition that a lot of the Spanish ships that have tried to board it are in, combined with the delay in spending almost a full day trying to capture the ship, then leads to, in the immediate aftermath, the loss of a whole bunch of them more, plus Revenge herself, in a storm. That's a very outsized impact in a very short period of time by one ship. And actually, considering we're talking about Spanish versus British or Spanish versus English at that point in time, the flip side would be something like Glorioso, which I've covered in its own video. Obviously, it's a Spanish ship this time, and she cripples, destroys, or sinks numerous British vessels before finally being, again, taken down in a final last stand. But her impact on overall numbers of armed British vessels in a relatively short time over a single voyage is very significant. ACC asks, I was recently in Venice and was captivated by a painting titled, and apologies to Italian listeners because I'm almost certainly going to butcher this horribly, but I'll try. Battaglia Navale del Canale di Mytilene of the 8th of September 1690, otherwise known as Naval Battle in the Channel of Mytilene. Painted in the late 17th century, possibly by Paolo Veronese, and the painting depicts a crossing of the T style of battle. And I was wondering, do historians know if the painting is an accurate description of the battle, and whether or not such paintings are used as primary sources about tactics when more reliable technical evidence is lacking? So I don't think that this is a particularly accurate depiction of the battle, because when I was looking at the actual description and history of the battle, I was thinking to myself, where on earth in the battle does this fit? Because this battle is supposed to take place in 1690, and, as you can tell, the long line of ships looks substantially more advanced than you'd expect for ships of the 1690s. Whereas in the actual battle, you have a larger force of Ottoman ships anchored defensively, mostly made up of galleys, being attacked by a smaller but individually heavier force of Venetian ships, primarily made up of sailing vessels. But so based on that, you can go, okay, well, clearly the anchored force or the stationary force on the left, that looks like galleys. That must be the Ottoman forces. That sort of seems roughly correct. But then the Venetian force, which in theory therefore must be this line of surprisingly identical ships of the line, appears to be considerably larger than the Ottoman force, which is completely the opposite of what's actually going on in the actual battle. In fact, there are more Venetian ships just in the foreground part of this line than there actually were in the total of the Venetian fleet. And this kind of brings up essentially the problem when you're looking at depictions of the battle, certainly older depictions where you can't interview or ask the artist what they're intending to show. And that is, some artwork will show, as near as the artist can tell, what actually happened. Sometimes maybe even the artist was there. And so those paintings can be fairly useful sources of information about a battle, but you have to know that it's accurate in the first place through other methods. Then you'd have paintings, which I think this one is, which attempt to show multiple parts of a battle in a single painting. So if I had to guess, I would say that the foreground part of this painting shows a particular moment during the engagement where the three lead Venetian ships, due to a lack of wind, are left facing off against the entire Ottoman force while the rest of the Venetian fleet tries to catch up behind them. And you can see these three ships depicted in somewhat more detail in the face of the Ottoman vessels. And then the latter part, there's kind of all the ships in the background, are presumably showing the aftermath, showing that the Venetian fleet is in fact leaving in good order with having suffered no losses. And you do sometimes get paintings that are depictions like this, where they'll show several stages of the battle, either in whole, in different parts of the painting, or they'll show, different things that are happening at different stages, at different times in the battle, but they're all in the same overall painting, so different segments, if you like. So, for example, in the hall that the 1805 Club uses in Portsmouth for their annual Trafalgar dinner, there's a big depiction of Trafalgar, and individual incidents shown taking part for an individual ship or a few ships all happened at Trafalgar, but they all happened at different times. So when you look at the thing as a whole, it is depicting Trafalgar, but it is not depicting any one moment at Trafalgar. It's depicting lots of different moments at Trafalgar. And then you have the wholly allegorical, which would be things like Turner's depiction of Trafalgar. Very, very famous, very large, very well executed painting. It shows kind of the theme, the perception of Trafalgar, but it doesn't actually show any historic moment at Trafalgar. Victory doesn't lose her foremast. There aren't people wandering around in boats and clinging to wreckage. Bucentaure and Redoutable didn't sink, etc., etc. So generally, when it comes to battle paintings, unless you know that the artist had very specific historical knowledge of what was going on, you always have to be very hesitant about using paintings to say that this is an accurate depiction of the battle. What's more common, especially for paintings painted very close to the time, is that the painting might not necessarily show the actual exact representation of what was going on at a specific moment in the battle, but they will tend to show what the ships looked like at the time. Obviously, the further forward in history you go, the more and more people tend to use what ships look like in their time as references. But certainly if a painting is within 10, 20 years of the actual battle occurring, very often the paintings can be very useful to see what kind of designs were in use. And sometimes, if we have access to drawings or other depictions of various ships, you can even pick out various ships and go, right, this is the artist depicting this particular ship in a given engagement. Texas and LaShock asks, I recall hearing some time ago that part of the inspiration for the film Operation Petticoat was from a submarine that had actually been stripped to a pink primer coat at some point. Have you heard anything about this? Weird as it might sound, the use of a pale pink colour as a camouflage colour was somewhat widespread during the Second World War, and actually continuously after that. There are some aircraft in, for example, the Gulf War that had a pale pink camouflage colour. Mostly it was common in the desert, both in the Gulf War and in World War II, because it actually blends surprisingly well in bright sunlight against sand. And also works very well towards dawn and dusk. So one of the often cited inspirations for the Operation Petticoat colour scheme is USS Hara, which during at least one of its war patrols had some pale pink colour applied to its upper works, because it was thought this would help her blend in on the horizon somewhat more, especially at sunrise and sunset. However, given the circumstances of exactly how the ostensible sea tiger in Operation Petticoat ends up with her pink colour, I think possibly the more likely inspiration, although it wasn't a deliberate painting thereof, is probably USS Sea Dragon, because like the Sea Tiger in the film, Sea Dragon was present in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked initially, and although, unlike Sea Tiger in the film, Sea Dragon wasn't sunk, she was rather badly heated and blistered by the fire nearby from various bomb hits, which blistered up all of her paint, and that meant that over the next few weeks, as she gradually made her way south, a lot of her exterior paint, which at the time was a black colour, very dark, started to peel away, and of course what was underneath was the red lead primer. And as that, which of course was never designed to be exposed long term to seawater or bright sunlight, started to fade, she gradually took on a somewhat dappled, where the black paint was still there, but mostly pink appearance, and eventually managed to get touched up, but not entirely. And given the circumstances of how she ends up with that, and the circumstances of Operation Petticoat, I think if they took inspiration at all, it's probably more from that incident than from Hara, which was a very deliberate choice. And if you're wondering, yes, there were other ships painted pink. HMS Kelly, a British destroyer, was at one point painted in a pale pink to see if that would work in the Mediterranean. Jim Smitty asks, once again, another question for In Passage Perilous, Malta and the Convoy Battles of June 1942, this time on page 185. On this page, Mr. O'Hara speaks of the motobomba. This he called a novel weapon as a self-propelled mine. I've not yet heard of the weapon prior to reading the book, and with the detail in the book itself being limited, could you shed any more light on what a motobomba was, and if used again by the Italians? Yep, so this is it. It's a kind of fun-sized, travel-sized torpedo. It's a 20-inch diameter weapon, and as you can see, considerably foreshortened. It's an electric device, and it doesn't have a particularly large warhead, but considering it's an anti-merchant ship weapon, it doesn't particularly need one compared to a full-size torpedo. Now, the innovative thing about this, and the reason why Vince O'Hara calls it more of a self-propelled mine, is because it has a very low top speed of about 10 to 15 knots, but it can keep going for around up to half an hour at that speed. And the reason it's so dangerous is, well, twofold. Firstly, the Italians had realised pretty quickly that having a big tri-motor torpedo bomber lumbering along at low speed at low altitude was a very good way to lose a lot of pilots and aircraft very quickly whilst trying to drop torpedoes. And so this thing was designed to be dropped basically like a bomb. Now, of course, the problem with high-altitude level bombing of convoys is that, sure, you could drop a bomb somewhere in the vicinity of a convoy, but actually hitting any ship in that convoy was very difficult. But it was much, much safer flying at high altitude, where you could potentially see enemy fighters coming and it would take a lot longer for them to get to you than it would be running around on low levels, as we just said. So this squared that particular circle because it is essentially shaped like a rather large bomb. But when you drop it, and you drop it like a bomb, so you can mount multiple of them in bomb bay, assuming you've got a high-performance enough bomber, and then it falls and parachutes down. Because obviously if you drop even a fun-sized torpedo from 20,000 feet or something like that, or even 10,000 feet, it's just going to smash into the water and disintegrate. So you put a parachute on it so it doesn't do that. It hits the water, and as soon as it hits the water, it goes, oh, I'm in the water. Right, time to motor. Now, you might be thinking, well, you're going to have basically no control over where it lands or where it heads at that point. And this would be true. This is why they didn't do it with normal torpedoes. But the extra fun feature of the motobomba, more probably the motobomba FFF, was that it had a fixed turning circle. And the turning circle wasn't a complete start at point A, come back to point A. It was slightly less than that. So once it got in the water, it would start circling in an ever-widening spiral, as we said, for about half an hour. And at that point, you can see why it suddenly is so dangerous, because you can drop loads of them from a high-performance bomber, and it doesn't matter where in and amongst the convoy they land initially, because if they start going in a spiral, eventually they will probably hit something. And obviously, if they do that, then great, mission accomplished. You've hit something. Congratulations, without putting your big, heavy bomber at risk. However, the other thing, which they were very useful for, particularly I suspect in this particular account about Pedestal, is that because you have a bunch of little torpedoes circling around in larger and larger and larger circles in the middle of your convoy has to break formation and break course to get out of the way of the things, because they're a persistent threat, whereas with a straight-running torpedo, it either hits you or it doesn't. Whereas with this thing, it might hit you this time around, and if it doesn't, it might hit you the next time around, and if it doesn't, it might hit you the next time around, and so on and so on and so forth. And that breaking up of the convoy formation was what then allowed what up until that point had been a fairly solid air defense net to be penetrated by more conventional aerial attackers. It would be used again by the Italians on several occasions, and also the Luftwaffe adopted it, as they did pretty much with every aerial torpedo the Italians used, because it turned out most of the German ones were trash. And the Germans also used it to some considerable success, particularly from both the Italian and the German perspective, when it came to the Allied invasions of Italian territory, because at that point you have harbours full of merchant ships, and using conventional torpedo bombers on those rather target-rich environments was pretty much suicide, because you'd have fighters, land-based AA, ship-based AA, and usually a pretty difficult approach run, and again, if you miss, then you've missed. Whereas with these things, you could fly in high and fast, kick them out the bomb bay, and as long as they land somewhere in the bay and they keep circling, they'll probably hit something, especially when a lot of the ships are at anchor and not really in a position to get out of the way if they see one coming closer and closer. And they do score quite a number of kills doing so. So, yeah, quite a fun little device, but something that the US, for example, was very keen on testing when it got its hands on it. But also, incidentally, another reason why you should never believe anything that's uncited on Wikipedia. Because if you go on to the motobomber page on there, it says it had a speed of 40 knots. No, it didn't. At no point, except maybe when it was falling through the air, did it have a top speed of 40 knots, and anyone with a lick of sense knowing anything about, one, electrically propelled torpedoes in general in World War II, and B, this particular kind of size and shape of torpedo, would ever in their right mind think that this thing was capable of anything like 40 knots. And you can also then tell which websites are just, using crawler bots to just copy and paste stuff from Wikipedia, because, again, if you do a search for motobomber FFF, you'll see that some sites, which have obviously actually done their research, cite top speeds of 10, 15 knots, 13 knots, 12 knots, etc., all of which are supported by various Allied documents, and, of course, actual well-written books and stuff on the subject, which is what I use to look up the capabilities of the thing. Whereas, you'll find a bunch of sites all saying pretty much exactly the same sentence as it appears on Wikipedia, because they're brainless morons. Sapper Ninja asks, I've recently been playing the game Terra Invicta, where you respond to an alien invasion of the solar system. TI also has a massive tech tree, and in researching through that tech tree, it can be easy to fall into traps. Two of the most common being committing very hard to a certain technology, only to then not being able to afford to develop the next tech that comes along, Or it's always very easy to be researching the next thing, as in the next type of missile, laser, or gun, as it's only months away, but never actually having any of them to hand. We've seen some issues with pushing R&D into the next big thing, but not building anything now in some modern navies. What are some notable historical examples of this kind of thing happening? Either missing the boat on new technology because you overcommitted to an old one, or waiting far too long just so you can try and get the next big thing. In some ways, the late 1860s and early 1870s Royal Navy could be seen as an example of missing the boat through overcommitment. Now, to be fair to the Royal Navy specifically, the Royal Navy used to have a Department of Naval Ordnance specifically for the Navy, and around about the time of the Crimean War, some bright spark thought that it would be a good idea to amalgamate that with the armies and just have a general ordnance section. Yeah, anytime the Royal Navy gets a bit of itself taken away and amalgamated into a broader multi-service unit, it never works out very well. And part of that was, well, fast forward to the early 1860s, or technically the late 1850s, when you have the Armstrong 110-pounder breech-loading rifled gun, and it has significant problems with its breech-loading mechanism. Some fairly serious safety and accuracy issues. But then as a result, instead of doing the sensible thing, which is going, okay, well, why does this breech-loading system work very well on Armstrong's lighter weight weapons, but not on this big one? And can we solve it and perhaps invent a different kind of breech, which gives all the benefits of a breech loader without the drawback of, well, accuracy, where you literally can't hit the broadside of a Japanese castle, and also occasionally randomly get the breeches thrown up into the roof of the gun deck that you're on with attendant backblast. Instead of doing all that, the powers that be on land are just like, no, clearly we must go back to muzzle-loading guns. And then everyone's like, yeah, but we kind of need rifled guns. Muzzle-loading rifled guns. Oh, great. So then for the next decade or so after the Royal Navy is made to abandon breech-loading rifled guns, you have ever-increasing and ever-implausible rifled muzzle loaders, like the ones fitted on HMS Thunderer here, and it actually takes HMS Thunderer accidentally double-loading one of her guns and then blowing up her turret to force people to go, okay, maybe we should have breech loaders now. Like the French have been doing for the last decade. Now, to be fair, it did lead to some rather entertaining loading systems and seeing just how far you can push the muzzled rifle loading concept, with things like Inflexible. But really, it was getting a bit silly there towards the end. And as far as researching anything and everything in the hopes of finding the next big thing, but then obviously not actually reaching most of those big things and having problems as a result, in some ways I would actually say the German U-boat arm of World War II falls into that category. Because when you look at the German U-boat type numbers, you've got the Type 2 coastal sub, then it's all the way up to the Type 7, this kind of go-to German U-boat. Then you've got the Type 9, okay, I was missing the Type 8, but whatever. Then you've got the Type 10 mine layers, okay, that follows on from the Type 9, fine. But then you've got the Type 14s, the milk cows, and then you go all the way up to the Type 21s and the Type 23s, and you realise, okay, well, even including the relatively small number of Type 2 coastal boats, you've got up to about 24 U-boat type numbers, and only 7 of them have actually been put into service. And of those, the 2s, the 10s, and the 14s in relatively small numbers. So essentially, you've only got 4 types from 24 type numbers that you've actually produced in any large amount. And it's a very similar thing when it comes to a lot of submarine technology, things like propulsion systems and so forth. The Germans are researching anything and everything when it comes to submarines. Do we have cruiser subs, small fast attack subs, big fast attack subs, large long distance attack submarines, dedicated mine layers, hybrid mine layers, the Walter propulsion system, the heavy electric propulsion system, and various other types of propulsion system for that matter. And so they're putting a bit of resource into everything, hoping that something will come out of it. Now, of course, occasionally something useful does come out of it with things like the Zaukoenig acoustic homing torpedoes. But Germany was not a country with a huge amount of naval infrastructure. It was not a country with a huge amount of budget to throw at naval infrastructure, and obviously in this case U-boat infrastructure specifically. And so focusing on a few things and doing them really well would have been a far better approach for them. I mean, the number of research projects they had for different types of U-boats and different types of U-boat subsystems dwarfs in a lot of respects some of the the broader research programs that were present in much larger navies with much better industrial bases like the British and the American navies, and produced arguably overall somewhat less, despite the fact that the Germans obviously were very heavily emphasizing their US. Now, of course, some of the things, again, that they did produce with things like early anechoic tiling and, as I said, the acoustic homing torpedoes and the mostly diesel-electric submarine, these were very good and important improvements, but they were almost a case of a broken clock is right twice a day, given the sheer number of projects that were thrown at the wall to see if anything stuck. And even then, some of the advances that are made are more a case of putting other pre-existing stuff together in a slightly different way rather than a true innovation. Because take the Type 21, for example, probably the single most important advancement, arguably outside of the homing torpedo, that the Germans made. And essentially, what are its innovations? It's a big double-hull submarine that's optimized for underwater performance. Well, sorry, submarines optimized for high-speed underwater performance had been done already in the First World War with things like the R-class, and big double-hull submarine, any number of late World War I and interwar submarines by any number of navies had done that. The fact that they took the two and combined them to make rather than a underwater hunter-killer with the short-range operation like the R-class, and made a large, long-distance, underwater-optimized oceanic submarine with the Type 21, that was the innovation, but it was more of a refinement of putting together concepts that other people had already proved and then tweaking it for their specific uses. Whereas, I say, given the importance of the German submarine effort, if they had concentrated on a slightly saner goal and just poured all their resources into that, they probably could have had a far more effective U-boat arm throughout the war. Bill Brockman asks, I read a lot of historical naval fiction. In the books, a midshipman will typically say, Lieutenant Jones sends his compliments and reports a ship off the port bow, and the captain will respond, give Lieutenant Jones my compliments and tell him to steer towards the ship. When did this polite packaging of messages disappear? Was it when things started moving much more quickly with steam and longer-range weapons? To a certain degree, yes. It kind of starts to die out in the late 19th century, although when you look at recorded exchanges, it is still there even in the early 20th century. Essentially, it comes down to what I believe these days is called the decision loop. So the time that you have between receipt of information and when you have to make a decision on how to act on that information before it becomes too late and either the enemy has reacted or some other thing has changed, so you need new information, and that resets the loop. So back in the age of sail, if you see a strange sail on the horizon or something like that, then realistically, even if you are in the fastest ship on the seas, and somehow, thanks to some weird weather shenanigans, the enemy is on a somewhat closing course, it's still going to be a very long time before either of your ships are in any kind of meaningful range to threaten each other. And even if it's potentially a case of you might need to run from the enemy, you've still got quite a while before you have to make that decision. And so the politeness that is, it's also a bit of a holdover from the social hierarchies of the very early parts of the Age of Sail, but still, it's all, possible, and it doesn't affect your decision loop because the extra few seconds it takes to be especially polite manifestly doesn't change things much at all. But as you get from the middle of the 19th century going towards the end of the 19th century, ship speeds are going up, but also the pertinent details are becoming more and more relevant. So back in the Age of Sail, does the ship have 1, 2, or 3 masts? Roughly how many gun decks does she have? That's most of the information you need. and also obviously a captain can just come forward and have a look himself. Whereas by, say, the end of the 19th century, there's a lot more complexity into identifying what kind of ship you may be looking at. There's a lot more that the captain has to do to prepare the ship for either combat or running or some combination thereof. And so suddenly you have to convey a lot more information much faster, and the captain has to then be able to process and act on all of that very quickly. And then, obviously, as you get into the 20th century and gun ranges start to increase, so the lethal radius as well as speed is going up, now it's very, very contingent on everybody to relay the maximum amount of relevant information as concisely as humanly possible to give the captain as much time as possible to react. And suddenly, that's when most of all of this polite packaging and messages vanishes. Although it is still around at times when there is the luxury. Brian Nicholas asks, during the interwar period in World War II, in your opinion, which ships designed or built were the most aesthetically pleasing for their ship type, i.e. destroyers, cruisers, battleships, carriers, etc.? And as it relates to this, do you think that navies should have reverted to their historical paint schemes or livery once the wars ended, i.e. white and buff for the US, black, white and buff for the British, etc., etc.? So with the colour scheme option, for the World War I, World War II period, I think it's still understandable why they keep the grey and blue various camo patterns that they do in between the wars and after the wars, because at that stage of things, visual targeting of vessels is actually still a major element of naval combat. And one of the reasons they moved away from the peacetime colour schemes to just having ships in default grey before World War I was because in the 18th and 19th century, you'd see war coming and mobilization would take a fair while. And so you could, even by the late 19th century, they understood that some shade of grey was probably better for wartime concealment. But they thought you would have time to repaint your ships. But then the Spanish-American War and the Russo-Japanese War showed that actually maybe you wouldn't. And so that kind of drove everybody to take a decision of, okay, we're going to now move to paint our ships grey in peacetime so that when war breaks out, they are in their wartime colours rather than we have to scramble to try and rapidly repaint everything and potentially lose out on the initiative. However, the peacetime colour schemes do look a heck of a lot better. And I think certainly as time progresses through the 20th and into the 21st centuries and visual spotting becomes less and less of an issue, because let's face it, pretty much all weapons by certainly the latter part of the 20th century are going to be guided by radar and infrared and so forth. And they really do not care what colour you're painted, because they're not looking at that part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And at that point, there is still a few visual guided weapons and so forth, but they're fairly minimal in a naval context. So at that point, you may as well actually, I think, go back from plain grey to the old peacetime colour schemes, because they were designed specifically to make an impact and to make you stand out and say, hey, this is us, this is our ship. Not just this is generic grey hull number 65, which could belong to any one of a number of nations unless you happen to be a really, really specific about spotting a ship. It just tells absolutely everyone, if you see a mostly white with gold colour scheme, this is a US ship. If you see a black hulled ship with white superstructure and buff highlights, this is a British ship. And it makes the point a lot more definitively. There's probably some argument these days about modern drones using visual find and fix, but to be perfectly honest, modern image fidelity I think has gone a little bit past oh no, we painted it grey, it blends in slightly better. I don't think a modern visual acquisition system is going to care all that much. As far as what looks good aesthetically, that's a lot more difficult, because different things appeal to different people for different aesthetic purposes. And even for me, different ships in the same category can have very different aesthetic appeals, but are all appealing, but for different reasons. So rather than try and rattle off a sort of a semi-random list, which might change the next day depending on how I'm feeling, I think maybe I should take that off to a Friday video at some point and do a kind of top 3 best looking ships for each category according to DRAC, because then that will allow me to cover 3 in each category and explain why I like them. So, for example, long-term viewers will know I have a thing for the New Mexico class, but the reasons I like the New Mexico class are very different to the reasons I like Hood or the North Carolinas, for example. W. Osterberg asks, would the 11-inch guns on the Sharnhorst class have made a difference if they were the standard type of guns on 11-inch armed ships of the German high seas fleet? And he also asks, how does this work? Do we get one question total, or one Drydock question and one alternate history question for the live video? So to answer the first bit, the second bit first, if you are a patron and you get your guaranteed Drydock question per month, it is one question, and it can be either a recorded Drydock question, kind of more history-based question, or it can be an alternate history-based question, but you only get one. If you submit more than one, then I will pick one to answer. And that's purely because, it turns out there are an awful lot of you who have picked that tier, and these days, for a typical month, I'm wading through something in the order of 120 to 140 questions, of which probably about 3/4 make it into this pair of recordings at this weekend. About 20 or so get into the other Drydocks that approach this one, purely just so I don't have a 7 to 8 hour runtime on these things, mostly. And then, of course, there are the alternate history questions as part of that sort of 120, 130 odd list. So if I gave everybody a Drydock question and an alternate history question, as fun as that might be, that would technically balloon the question count to well over 200, at which point the Drydocks would just become purely probably 2-hour-long Patreon Q&As every week, forever and eternity, and no one would get a look in from the regular videos. So yeah, sadly, one question only. But to answer your question, potentially these guns, as you can see here on the Sharnhorst, could have made a difference. Now, of course, there aren't that many German battleships in the high seas fleet with 11-inch guns, just the Nassaus, and, well, they didn't do a huge amount of anything. But most of the German battlecruisers did have 11-inch guns, Seydlitz, von der Tann, and Moltke specifically. And although obviously Der Flinger and Lutz are flinging 12-inch guns, so it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference to them, but whereas the 9-inch armour of the British battlecruisers, at least the Splendid Cats, generally was capable of stopping an 11-inch shell at the kind of ranges they were fighting at, they definitely wouldn't be able to stop a Sharnhorst-style 11-inch gun at that kind of range. The armour penetration was considerably higher with the Sharnhorst guns. And actually, at the 16,000-ish yard range, which was fairly common at Jutland, the Sharnhorst type 11-inch gun would, in theory, actually be a threat to a considerable number of British battleships. Not quite the Queen Elizabeths and the Revengers. So when 5th Battle Squadron shows up, their armour would still protect them. But if the range drops to, say, 12,000, 13,000 yards, then even the Queen Elizabeth's armour would be vulnerable to the German battlecruisers armed with Sharnhorst-style guns. And as I said, pretty much anything that's not them would be somewhat vulnerable at the typical ranges that Jutland was fought at. Obviously, the flip side is it doesn't do anything to make the German battlecruisers any more proof against incoming 15-inch shells, and an awful lot of German gun turrets were knocked out. But yeah, it's going to make a difference because some of those 11-inch shell hits that don't penetrate might penetrate their various targets. Smokey the Bear asks, regarding Hara's book, Japanese Destroyer Captain, you recently mentioned he had a high of opinion of himself regarding torpedo tactics. He states that early, before the World War II naval battles, as a destroyer torpedo officer, his scores in exercises were dismal and failing, and so were everyone else's. He then claims to have developed torpedo tactics that solved the failures with the ship's course adjusted to a hyperbola. If the last claim is not valid, or at least more claimed than deserved, is there any truth to the torpedo attack exercise failures, or is what he said in the book just hyperbole? It is true that Hara was at the heart of rewriting Japanese surface unit torpedo tactics before Japanese involvement in World War II. He was a torpedo specialist. He was very good at his job. However, as I've said, before, a lot of Hara's book is very good to read. However, he does, to a certain degree, almost fall into the great man syndrome trap when it comes to his own appreciation of things, or his own appreciation, shall I say, of himself. Now, and you have to walk a very fine line saying something like that, because, as I said, Hara was a very competent, very skilled naval officer. You can't take that away from him. He knew what he was doing for the most part, and he knew what he was doing better than most of his contemporaries. I mean, apart from anything else, and a bit of a streak of luck, he survived the war, where a lot of his contemporaries did not, which, that means he was either very skilled or very lucky, or both. And you, just from the fact he managed to actually survive to write his memoirs, despite being on the front lines quite a bit. However, with that said, while he is a key player in rewriting Japanese torpedo tactics, which do need to be rewritten because the Japanese have invented these newer, more capable, faster, longer-range torpedoes, but the old torpedo tactics generally are not working because they're not really configured to take account of these kind of weapons. But he is doing that as part of a system. As I said, he's in the middle of it, but he is not the only one. So he helps rewrite the Japanese torpedo tactics textbook, but he doesn't do it alone. There are a number of other key officers, some of which are actually mentioned in his book, who either work with him or have laid the groundwork that he builds on, or go on to build on the work that he did and continue teaching. Because, of course, at some point he is transferred to frontline command of destroyers, and what he has done has to be continued by others and to a certain extent developed upon, so that other people coming through the torpedo school can learn and implement similar or improved tactics. I would say in some respects, with regards to Japanese torpedo tactics, you could put Hara in the place of somebody like, for example, Oppenheimer in the atomic bomb project, or a number of other key figures in that project, in that it would be very, very difficult to have the atomic bomb without Oppenheimer, or, as I said, a number of other key figures, but Oppenheimer could not have built a nuclear bomb on his own. And similarly, it would be very difficult to have Japanese torpedo tactics for World War II in the shape that they were at the start of the war without Hara, but Hara did not single-handedly redo everything there was to do about Japanese torpedo tactics. Brad asks, we've seen several videos on fire control and rangefinders for guns. How did torpedo paths get set? There's two elements there. Obviously, one element would be what kind of torpedo fire control system do you have? Do you have, for example, in World War II, a US torpedo data computer Mark I, as opposed to the cut-down Mark II version? Do you have a standard torpedo director, which would be the Royal Navy's version? Or do you have some other form of mechanical calculator? And obviously those would generate a fire control solution for you based on the data you put in. The main difference between, for example, the American and the British systems is that the British system you would give it the data in terms of your target's bearing, speed, etc., and it would spit out a solution, and that solution was good for the data you'd just given it. But if you decided you weren't going to fire your torpedoes just then, and you were perhaps going to fire them in a minute or two, well, you'd have to give it a new set of data in a minute or two to get a new fire control solution. Whereas with the American system, it tracked, assuming that the inputs you'd given it were accurate, it would keep that data and continually give you fresh fire control solutions as obviously the range and relative bearing changed, and you could dial it back and forth. And there were simpler versions in some navies, submarines, and of course in World War I it was simpler still, but essentially by some method, whether it possibly even by hand or by mechanical computer, you had data that you needed to give the torpedo. And then you actually had to put that information into the torpedo, because of course the torpedo is a self-guiding device as opposed to a shell where you just point the gun and the gun fires. So once the torpedo is in the tube, you have to tell the gyro, I want you to turn left in 500 yards, or obviously the other systems, I want you to keep 10-foot depth, 15-foot depth, I want you to go at this speed or that speed, etc. And for that, as you can see here on this torpedo aboard USS Cod, you have these little circular indents or plates on the torpedo. And obviously on different nations' torpedo tubes, these will be in different places, hence why you can't just cross-use torpedoes, because on different torpedo tubes, different torpedoes, they're all going to be in different locations. But anyway, the point is each of these will correspond to a speed, the speed setting, the gyro setting, the depth setting, etc. And there'll be little mechanical, essentially keys, that drop down usually from above in a torpedo tube and adjust that. So they adjust the torpedo in the tube based on the inputs that you're putting in. Now, obviously, if you're using a mechanical fire control computer, once you've activated these little drop-down keys or levers, then it can put those values in itself. If you've calculated everything manually, then you have to dial it in manually, and the manual backup is always there. Then you withdraw them, and then the torpedo can be fired. And if you want a sort of live view of what that actually looks like, if you go and watch my video on USS Cod, near the beginning, there's actually me sticking the camera in the torpedo tube, and you can see the various keys or actuators being dropped down as I tell you what each one does. Bald Man Dan asks, 2 related questions. First, when did the US Navy start using starred flags to indicate the presence of a flag officer aboard? Is it something used today, and how far back does it start? And second, what rank of admiral would typically have held positions such as Admiral of the Pacific Fleet, Atlantic Fleet, and so forth before the start of US involvement in World War II? I know that after the introduction of the 5th Star for certain officers, some of the positions were changed, but what were these positions before that introduction? Also, will there ever be more naval design contests? So, will there be more naval design contests? I don't know. The last one, even years later, is still in judging hell, but essentially it comes down to, as the channel grows, there obviously are going to be more entries. If there are going to be more entries, which takes exponentially more time to judge, hence the need for other judges. But also, obviously, there's the fact of how do you go about running such a thing? Because if you use something like ShipScribe, that requires people to learn how to use ShipScribe, which, it's not a degree, a university degree needed to run it, but it is a little bit complicated to understand if you're just looking at it for the first time, compared to something like the Ship Creator and Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, which is much easier to comprehend, I think, for an absolute beginner, but of course requires someone to actually have Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts as a game. And, I'm kind of torn between, well, there are some free resources out there like ShipScribe, which anyone can take part in. So if I'm announcing a competition for anyone, it seems only fair that they should be able to just do it. Conversely, it would be much easier to judge something that's been done in Rule the Waves 3 or Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts or something like that. But I have significant reservations about saying to people, hey, well, there's this competition, but unless you already own it, you have to pay to buy the software to take part. I don't feel necessarily particularly comfortable with that. So, yeah, pending. Anyway, on to your main questions. When did the US first start to use starred flags for flag officers? I believe that's around the late American Civil War period, so the middle of the 1860s, because for most of its history prior to that, the US Navy was significantly averse to having flag officers, period. I mean, admittedly, okay, up prior to that, for a lot of the time, the US Navy was small enough it didn't really need flag officers, but that's another matter. But occasionally you would end up in situations where, by all rights, the formation that was being sent out was something that should have a flag officer in charge, but their rank didn't exist, so there was no admiral, and therefore you just had commodore. So if you look at the force that the US gathered for the First and Second Barbary Wars, for example, some of the formations that they gathered, admittedly not having any ships of the line, but still were large enough numerically that in most circumstances in other navies, those formations would have been commanded by an admiral of some description. But because that rank didn't exist in the early 1800s in the US Navy, the best they could do was commodore, which was essentially guy who was in charge of more than one ship. But then, I believe it was in the late 1850s, the US Navy finally admitted, yeah, we should probably have actual flag ranks. And then they went on in the mid-1860s to go, hey, we got you a shiny flag if you happen to be an officer. Some changes were made between then and the present day flag rank flags, but the principle of a starred flag for an admiral on board was established at that point. Now, in terms of the US interwar positions, at the time, and I'm not sure if this still applies to the modern US Navy. If you happen to be in the modern US Navy, let me know in the comments below. But at the time, in the 1930s, unlike, say, the Royal Navy, you could not have a permanent rank higher than a rear admiral. That's why we've got this picture of this 2-star admiral here. So you'd advance through the ranks, holding different commands, you'd reach this rank, but then if you were then assigned to a specific role, commander of a specific force that was a significantly large one, your rank as either a vice admiral or a full admiral, so a 3-star or a 4-star, would be dependent on you holding that command. So, for example, I believe if you were the commander of the Pacific Fleet's carriers in, let's say, 1935, that would be a vice admiral position. So you would become a vice admiral while you were commanding the carriers. If you then went on to become the commander-in-chief of the US Pacific Fleet, which would be a 4-star position, you would then become a 4-star admiral. But if, let's say, you were the commander of the carriers and you were slated to become the commander of the Pacific Fleet, but there was a 6-month window between you ceasing to be the carrier commander and your predecessor as Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet leaving his role, for those 6 months, you would revert back to a rear admiral because you were no longer holding the command which came with a vice admiral's rank. So the rank was tied to the position, as opposed to in the Royal Navy, where if you become a vice admiral or an admiral, it doesn't matter whether you're in command of 1 ship, 2 ships, a fleet, ashore, retired, you are still that rank. And the 5-star position, the fleet admiral position, that's a slightly different thing because obviously that's specifically created by Congress. But it means that when you see people from the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s that aren't the 5 stars, when they are retired, they'll be referred to as Rear Admiral so-and-so because that is their actual permanent rank. And they may have had a Vice Admiral or Full Admiral rank during, let's say, World War II, but since they no longer hold that command, they don't hold that rank. Now, as I say, I don't know if that still holds true in the US Navy these days, whether flag rank of Vice and Full Admiral is still tied specifically to commands or whether it's now something intrinsic to your career. Let me know in the comments below. The Rogue Chief asks, what would be necessary from time and financial standpoints to increase the armament of the 1930s King George V's like the North Carolinas were able to do? And how might these delays affect British responses to Operation Rheinübung? Realistically, I think you're probably looking at the very end of 1935, early 1936, because it's at the very beginning of 1936 that the King George V design is still looking at 3 quadruple 14-inch, but in late 1935, they have still been batting around triple 15-inch options as well, and, well, the occasional foray into potentially a 16-inch, but it's in early 36 when they resolved to try and sort out the armament process in terms of keeping to the 35,000-ton weight limit by switching, as it turns out, B quadruple turret for B into a twin turret, which is what you historically get. Once that design is properly locked in, I don't think there's a realistic way to change the armament in terms of upscaling it without massive alterations to the ship, which would be unacceptable in a rearmament environment, simply because, well, as the North Carolinas proved, switching quad 14 for a triple, in their case 16, or in the British case either triple 15 or triple 16, is doable. But if you've got a twin 14-inch turret, that's not going to really give you enough room to upgrade to even a twin 15 or 16-inch. Plus, of course, even if you did upgrade, let's say, if we're being generous, twin 14 to a twin 15, and it's just a little bit cramped, if you're switching the quads from quads to triples, then that gives you an 8-gun armament, which is, 8 15-inch guns. Okay, they'd be more modern 15-inch guns, but objectively that's no bigger a broadside than the Queen Elizabeths or the Revenges or Hood, and you've got Nelson and Rodney sitting in the background there. But I think if they did choose to upgrade the armament, let's say January 36, they decide, stuff this, treaty system's clearly collapsing, we're going to go with 15 or 16-inch armament, I think it would depend on exactly how much they think the treaty system is going by the wayside, because they know that the Germans are building the Bismarcks with 15-inch guns. They know the French are going to be building the Richelieus with 15-inch guns. They know basically Europe's building with 15-inch guns. So between that and obviously the slightly less weight implications of a 15-inch gun, I think it's far more plausible for them to just go back to a slightly earlier design revision and go, actually, we'll take triple 15s. And, well, to be perfectly honest, especially in hindsight, if they take the triple 15s and the 10 4.5-inch, which was the original King George V secondary battery, I'd be really happy. To go with triple 16s could be done, but that would require both the government and the Navy to go, okay, yeah, the treaty system is completely gone out the window, and we need to start development on a brand new gun ASAP. Now, I don't actually think that these changes would affect the British response to Rheinebung, because the construction of the ship itself can still go ahead. The fitting of the guns themselves, although the guns are a long lead item that you have to order right at the very start, that doesn't occur until the fitting out stage. So the entire construction launch phase of the ship is completely unaffected by the availability of the guns. And even if we look at the 16-inch developmental cycle, which was a little bit problematic for the Lion class, while there were some delays in the actual design and build of the guns, another part of the forecast delays was, well, Britain was at war at that point, and the industry required to manufacture the guns and their turrets and their mountings was desperately needed for lots of other things as well. But, with that said, given the design date of the 16-inch gun historically, even with all the wartime delays, it was anticipated the guns would be ready by early to mid-1943, so about 4 to 4.5 years. And if you started development of the 16-inch gun instead in early 1936, then that would suggest that the 16-inch guns would be ready in early to mid-1940, which is well in time for the commissioning of King George V. The 15-inch, I think, would have been a better and safer bet, because they looked somewhat into designing that thing a year earlier in 1935, so that even if it had been delayed, which I don't think it necessarily would have been, but even if it had been, the guns would have been ready well over a year before King George V needed to commission, which would have been absolutely fine. Red Ranger asks, my father recently shared a video with me regarding PT boats of the Guadalcanal campaign, in which, according to the story, some crews modified their boats to mount various unapproved armaments, such as cannon from wrecked P-39s and the M3 anti-tank gun. While the story itself was enjoyable, the AI nature of the narration has me rather wary of accepting it as anything other than a work of fiction. Did anything like this actually happen, or was it just AI hallucination? So, using the 37mm from an Airacobra was actually surprisingly common on a number of PT boats in the Pacific. Well, here's a picture of a whole bunch of them, and you can find many more from the World War II period, with some of those 37mm up on the bow. The distinction where you know it's one of the 37mm from an Airacobra is you have this massive circular drum mag, because of course the thing has to be loaded with all its ammunition before it takes off, so hence massive magazine. Whereas something like an M3 37mm anti-tank gun, that's hand-loaded out in the field. So it doesn't have a gigantic drum mag fitted to it. Now, as far as the M3 goes, obviously, famously, PT-109 had one strapped to her deck just before she was lost, but I haven't seen much, if any, reference to that being a particularly common practice. I wouldn't necessarily go hand on heart and say that PT-109 was absolutely unique, because, hey, there were a lot of PT boats, and the crews were extremely motivated to find literally anything and everything they could fit in terms of additional firepower to strap to their boats. But the vast majority of 37mm retrofits you're going to find on PT boats in the Pacific are going to be from Airacobras, especially because it seems the US AAF didn't really care what happened to the Airacobras, whereas they were a little bit more precious about their M3s. That's the anti-tank guns, obviously. Well, the tanks as well, I suppose. Dubsington asks, how common was it to actually wear anti-flash gear in the World War II timeframe? Photos from the period rarely show, if ever, show it being worn, even in combat images. How much variance was there in gear policy, i.e. when you actually don it, between different ships, ship types, and navies? Technically speaking, all navies had pretty strict anti-flash gear policies, but practically speaking, it varied massively. In large part based on the environment, but you've also got to remember there's a degree of perception involved, because what anti-flash gear consists of in the Second World War is not necessarily the same as what anti-flash gear consists of these days, and on top of that, obviously, it varies from navy to navy. So, for example, these are some British sailors on HMS Jamaica, basically with all their anti-flash gear in place. You can see they've got gloves, they've got hoods, but it's nowhere near as extensive or as all-encompassing as modern anti-flash gear, although some anti-flash gear that looks very similar to modern stuff was around in the Second World War. But as you can probably tell from the rest of their clothing, they're operating in a pretty cold, damp environment, so the idea of, hey, we get to stick some extra layers on to keep us a bit warmer is not exactly exotic to them. Whereas if you go over to, say, the middle of the Pacific at the height of summer, being told, hey, put on these big thick gloves and this lovely thick white cotton or other treated material hood that's very close fitting, most people are just going to go, no, I don't want to die of heat stroke, against the relatively remote possibility I might need some protection against a fire. And so in those circumstances, you would see people, well, barely wearing any uniform at all, let alone extensive anti-flash gear. And since the vast majority of combat photos in the Second World War come from the warmer climes of said war, it's not unusual that most of them would have ditched the anti-flash gear. And when you read accounts, a lot of the time people will openly admit, it's like, yeah, we were supposed to be wearing anti-flash gear, we're also supposed to be wearing helmets and coveralls and all other sorts of bits of uniforms. We weren't wearing any of that stuff because it was hot and heavy work, and, well, again, didn't want to die of heat stroke, guaranteed, compared to the slight survival benefit we might get from anti-flash gear if we were hit. Nathan Redder asks, which anti-aircraft light cruiser turret layout was more effective? De Grassa, Worcester, Dido, or Atlanta? And if none of these are ideal, what armament and layout would you make? I think it very much depends on exactly what time period you're looking at for anti-aircraft light cruisers, because the De Grassa, as seen here, and the Worcester represent kind of a stage after the Didos and the Atlantas. So in this case, De Grassa, and in Worcester as well, you are looking at a heavy battery of long-range heavy anti-aircraft guns, but the secondary anti-aircraft battery is also relatively heavy anti-aircraft guns, around about 3-inch guns, depending on exactly which ship you're looking at. And so for those, you're going to have fewer installations, and therefore you want to have the greatest arcs of fire for them, as compared to the Didos or the Atlantas, which by kind of the mid-war period are going to have a bunch of 20mm and 40mm installed on them as well. So when it comes to these kind of the post-war environment, if you like, which de Grasser and Worcester are more representative of, I would say that the de Grasser's layout is probably slightly more optimal, in as much as if you are facing off against incoming attackers using missiles, rockets, and bombs, which is kind of your post-war threat environment, the fact that you have these two massive clusters of mixed caliber guns, fore and aft, which can almost all track in almost all arcs that are relevant, is probably better. However, some of the de Grasser's guns are masked from low-altitude broadside firing, in which case Worcester's armament is somewhat better, but that reflects potential low-level attacks by, say, torpedo bombers, which are less of an issue in the post-war environment. Whereas with the Didos and the Atlantas, you're looking at perhaps a more swarming style of attack, and a style which involves both high-altitude and low-altitude attackers. And I would say neither the Dido nor the Atlanta is perfect. The Atlanta has pretty much the perfect centerline anti-aircraft arrangement with the triple superfiring forward, triple superfiring aft, whereas the Dido lacks the additional third superfiring aft turret. However, the Atlantas also have the wing-mounted turrets, which admittedly they do give you an additional couple of guns on either side. But even with the Atlantas, they found, stability-wise and efficiency-wise, it was better to replace them with lots more anti-aircraft guns of a smaller caliber, 20 or 40mm, which is what you see on, say, the Juno class. So if you were going with for a World War II era anti-aircraft cruiser, where you do have to worry about significant low-level torpedo bomber threats, then I would essentially take almost the Juno approach of having triple superfiring stacks fore and aft on the center line, and then you devote your midship section to your light and medium AA guns, your 20mm and 40mm, so you have a fully comprehensive degree of coverage. Whereas once you get to the post-war environment and the attackers are more likely to be coming in, as I said, with bombs and missiles rather than with torpedoes, and you have to have just kind of all aspect, all-around fire, and your lighter anti-aircraft guns are now going to be kind of 3-inch 100mm style weapons, then the de Grasser layout is probably better, with the Worcester layout kind of representing an advanced version of the Juno layout. Peter Dasso asks, in World of Warships, there are numerous what-if ships that substitute normal guns for a larger quantity of smaller caliber weapons. For example, a battleship with 8-inch guns, or a large cruiser hull with a ton of 5-inch guns. Are there any real examples of ships doing this in the period that the channel covers, excluding training ships like Wyoming? Not particularly, because the vast majority of the designs that you see in World of Warships, like, say, battleships with 8-inch guns, big cruisers like the Hawaii, for example, with loads of 5-inch guns, there are a bunch of paper designs from the immediate post-war period where they're looking at ways of getting lots of anti-aircraft firepower onto hulls for which they don't otherwise see any particular usage. And of course, most of those projects just don't happen because it gets very rapidly overtaken by surface-to-air missile ideas or budgetary cuts and so forth. There are a handful of, if you like, real-life ships which you could argue do reflect this. So that's why I've got the Atlanta up here. Now, of course, the Atlanta is not a large cruiser hull, but she is still a cruiser, and she is armed exclusively with destroyer-grade weaponry. The Didos would be on the, I think, just the other edge of that very, very fine dividing line, in that the 5.25-inch was held to be a cruiser-grade weapon, albeit a very small one, whereas the 5-inch gun, the 5-inch 38, was a secondary weapon for large ships and a primary weapon for destroyers. So on that very, very fine knife edge, so rest it. Then one of the very few other examples you could potentially argue would be the Monmouth class. That would be the pre-World War I Monmouth class, because they are, technically speaking, armoured cruisers. They're pretty large hulls, as far as cruisers of the time go, but whereas almost every other class of armoured cruiser has some kind of large caliber weapon, whether that be a 7.5-inch gun, an 8.2, an 8.3, a 9.2, or an 8-inch gun, or a 10-inch gun even. At least two, usually sometimes four or more. The Monmouths were armed exclusively with 6-inch guns, which were held generally to be an armoured cruiser's secondary battery. So I guess that would be an example of perhaps an overly large hull for the period, armed with somewhat lighter guns. But generally, this wasn't common, because essentially in an era when surface gunfights were still very much a consideration, and anti-aircraft firepower up until the Second World War wasn't really seen as massively important, in large part because aircraft just weren't really much of a threat until shortly before the Second World War. If you have a ship hull that is armed with undersized weaponry, then, especially in the treaty era, but even before then, you're just asking for someone with a similar sized hull to come along with bigger guns and sink you. Kra F1 asks, were the Yamatos the first and only Japanese battleships with triple gun turrets? And were there any known difficulties in developing these compared to the previous twin turrets? In terms of Japanese battleships actually built, yes, the Yamatos were the only ones with triple turrets, because everything before them had twins of varying calibers. But there were quite a number of battleship designs that the Japanese had either developed themselves or had developed for them, depending on how far back you go, with triple turrets. And so, as far as I'm aware, apart from just the sheer size and weight of the blasted things, there weren't any particular engineering difficulties with developing the Yamato's triple turrets as compared to previous twin turrets, say, outside of just the sheer weight and size of them. And that was because, yes, it was the first Japanese triple turret on a battleship. It wasn't the first Japanese triple turret. I mean, well, you can see in this photo, there's a triple 6-inch turret taken from the Megami stuck on top of Yamato, and a couple on either side as well. Obviously, there's one aft, but you can't see it in this photo. So, going somewhat further back than the Yamato design process, the Japanese had experience on how to build triple turrets, albeit just not at battleship scale. And to be honest, by the 1930s, the triple turret was a pretty solved issue. People had been building them before the First World War. It wasn't that difficult for the Japanese to work out how to do it for themselves, and indeed they had done it. It's just a matter of upscaling it to a battleship level. As I mentioned, there were some challenges involved around the thickness of the armour and just the sheer size of the bearings and motors you needed to move them, but that was just a product of the size of the things, not the fact that they were triples per se. Even if they'd been twins, they'd still need ridiculously thick faceplate armour, for example. Pedden Harley asks, who is your favourite or a favourite person from English naval history whose career took place prior to the year 1500? And could you tell us a bit about their exploits? Have they ever had a later Royal Navy ship named after them? I think I'd probably have to go for King Alfred. He did actually take part in some naval engagements, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as well as being, to some degree, sort of the father of the Royal Navy. I mean, the Royal Navy obviously waned quite a bit in the interim between his reign and when it kind of really got kick-started again by Henry VIII. But the fleet founded by Alfred could be argued to be the initial foundation of the Royal Navy. And, as well as, actually being a ruler who put his money where his mouth is, because as I said, not only did he fight on the front lines on land, he also took part in at least one naval engagement, leading boarding parties. And it was a fairly clear-headed, pragmatic way of dealing with things, because when Norse raiders and Danish raiders and so forth came and landed on English shores, it was a bit of a problem, because, of course, once they were ashore, they would don their armour, grab all their weapons and go raiding, and they were very difficult to track down and stop. And so his idea was, okay, well, these Viking ships, raiding ships, are fast, shallow draft vessels designed primarily to get in, get as far up the river systems and into bays as possible, do their raiding and get out. We don't need raiding vessels, we need vessels to stop them before they actually get there. And so he commissions much larger, longer vessels, which according to some accounts are even said to also be swifter, just perhaps not necessarily quite as agile. But in the naval warfare of the period, when naval warfare consists basically of sailing up to the other guy and having a small land battle, except with additional drowning problems, having the bigger ship with the higher deck is a huge advantage. You see that even in the various Norse chronicles, where when it comes down to naval engagements between various Norse rulers and chiefs, the person who has the big dragon ship often has a very large advantage, and even if their overall fleet loses, taking the big ships is actually really difficult because, well, they've got more men and you've got the height advantage. So Alfred building an entire fleet of these obviously was a good idea, because then also these ships are going out with the express purpose of engaging in sea warfare. So they'll have a bunch of men crewing it, so to sail and row it, but they'll have a large party of heavily armed and heavily armoured men ready to fight. Whereas the smaller, long ships will generally, although pretty much everyone on board can fight, they're not rowing and sailing around in their armour, because they're obviously travelling long distances. They would put ashore and then put their armour on. So when Alfred's ships confront the raiders, generally speaking, in a one-on-one action, the English ship will have more men and more heavily armed and armoured men and a fighting advantage, and therefore, unsurprisingly, they generally come out on top. They don't always do so. There's one particular engagement where, because the English fleet at this point is still relatively small, they go after just over a dozen raiding ships. They capture them, kill everyone on board, and they're feeling pretty good about themselves, about to head home. But then a much, much larger fleet shows up, presumably following up on what had been their vanguard, and that fleet manages, mostly by sheer numbers after a prolonged and protracted engagement, to overwhelm that particular contingent of Alfred's fleet. So, the battles go back and forth, but generally speaking, in most engagements, the English ships get the better of the raiders and, fulfill their purposes, stop the raiders out at sea, therefore the shore is safe. So a good pragmatic way of dealing with incursions onto English soil, and, as I said, a ruler who actually does fight his own battles occasionally. So Alfred the Great, one of my favourites, and yes, there have been plenty of ships called King Alfred or Royal Alfred in the Royal Navy. Duke Master asks, watching your video on the Battle of the Barents Sea made me realise the folly of using large surface ships as commerce raiders. It seems to be a colossal waste of resources. The Kriegsmarine was constantly looking for opportunities to send ships out during other operations, to the point when they were told not to engage equal enemy forces and in order to avoid damage to the raider, which ends up with them almost never using their ships for their intended purpose and instead waiting and hoping for just the right moment that never ends up happening. It's like they were trying so hard not to lose, they weren't trying hard enough to win. What are your thoughts? I think the use of large ships as commerce raiders very much depends on your relative naval balance, your relative situation. And there are times when this can be a good idea, but they are very rare. And for the Germans, it was, I agree, a pretty bad idea. Simply because from the German situation, you have a very small number of large surface warships. And your opponent, which for the most part is going to be the British, although early on it's the British and the French, later on it's the British and the Americans, whatever combination, your opponent has more ships than you. They have ships that are as large or larger, and therefore also as heavily armed or more heavily armed, than the vast majority of the ships that you have. And even with the handful of ships that you have that are competitive at the absolute top end, i.e. Bismarck and Tirpitz, your enemy has more ships of a comparable level of power. The British build 5 King George V's, for example, compared to just the 2 Bismarcks, and that's not including any other capital ships that either the British have or that the Americans bring in later on, or the French potentially could have brought in if they'd been in the war longer, etc., etc. So At that point, the best you can hope for is an equal match. But more realistically, and as they tended to find, if you send out a Hipper or a Deutschland or even the Sharnhorsts, the British can put, and their allies can put, more ships with more firepower out at sea to counter you, which is almost always going to be an unequal fight. And the lack of a desire to engage in an equal fight is predicated in large part on the fact that some of those, or many of those ships with greater firepower, were perhaps a little bit slower. But if you engage in an equal fight, say a Hipper against a county, for example, and you take some damage, that's probably going to slow you down, which means you are then almost certain to be hunted down and horribly killed by one of those much bigger ships, like, say, an old R-class or something. Now, there are certain advantages to using a large surface ship as a commerce raider. Theoretically, obviously, compared to something like a destroyer, they're going to have a very long range. They are going to have a fair degree of firepower, so they can put down either a target very quickly or lots of targets relatively quickly, like if they catch a convoy or something. But that all is obviously predicated, as I said, on what your enemy can do as a response. So, for example, if you have roughly equal or slightly superior forces, then using large surface vessels as raiders does make sense, because if the numerical parity is close to or near exact, then if you send out a few of your heavy ships, so we're talking about large cruiser or larger, then the enemy has to cover lots of places at once. Now, obviously, if there's a huge numerical disparity, the enemy can do that. However, if the numerical disparity doesn't exist, then if they want to catch you, then they need to put out almost all their heavy units, most likely paired up or more, and that means that the rest of your heavy ships can take operational advantage of that significant distraction. Or, alternatively, the enemy sends out a roughly equal force to that which you've sent out, which means that your two main fleets are still roughly at parity, but that means that either your raiding force is not going to be detected because the sea is very big, in which case you get to go out and kill a bunch of merchant ships and there's nothing much they can do about it, or worst case, you end up in a roughly equal fight, at which point, given that your remaining fleets are roughly equal, it's actually probably worth engaging in that fight and trying to win that fight. So, in those circumstances, using large combat vessels as merchant raiders does make a certain degree of sense. But for someone like the Kriegsmarine, it really doesn't. If you're going to be the Kriegsmarine and do surface raiding, your two most effective choices are either going to be disguised armed merchant raiders, aka the Hilfskreuzer, because, well, they're better at hiding, they're better at long-distance operations, and they can still kill pretty much any merchant ship they come across. And, well, you weren't engaging escorts anyway, so why do they need anything that's particularly more heavily armed? Or else, the alternative would be some extremely high speed, maybe 35 knot plus, light cruiser armed with, in the Germans' case, some 5.9-inch guns. Not the Königsbergs, because they'll just twist themselves to pieces in the Atlantic, but something actually seaworthy with a bunch of rapid-fire 5.9-inch guns and high speed, because with that, you're still just as capable at taking out the convoys of merchant ships and everything. You're a bit more capable when it comes to taking out light escorts like destroyers, minesweepers, trawlers, that kind of stuff. So it does force your opponent to put some actual heavy ships on the escort duty, but you retain the speed, unlike the Deutschlands, to get away from even a heavy cruiser. And you might, depending on circumstances, be able to snipe off the occasional ship out of a convoy. So, for example, if you spot a convoy or a U-boat spots a convoy and okay, there's a heavy cruiser escorting it, but say that heavy cruiser is at the aft end of the convoy, well, you can use your speed overnight to get to the front end of the convoy, dash in, shoot up a couple of merchant ships, and by the time the heavy cruiser's worked up its own speed and have begun crossing through the convoy to try and get at you, you can just turn around and leave. Alex Moskowitz asks, if you built lightly armed or armoured but easily upgradable ships to comply with the treaties, as discussed in a recent Drydock, and then refit them as soon as a war starts, wouldn't this be a bad idea? Because, well, you'd need those ships, and also the Drydock space would also be pretty desperately needed for repairing wartime damage. In theory, yes, that would actually be a major problem, and it would be a bad idea. However, you don't, strictly speaking, have to start the upgrades after the war has begun. And I mean, that might sound a little bit strange to modern ears, because I guess in the modern period we're used to wars generally being something that, at least to the public perception, just happens. Obviously in the geopolitical sphere there's a significantly more knowledge about build-up, but also time lag and so forth, in terms of how long it takes to build modern combatants. But back in the period that the Channel covers, the fact that a war was coming, especially if you were the one who was planning to launch it, was much, much more known, much more easily either telegraphed if you're expecting the war to come, or obviously if you're planning to launch the war, you're planning to launch said war well in advance of said war actually happening, ideally. So at that point, if you have these kind of treaty circumventing vessels, then when you know that you're about to launch a war, that's when you start doing the refits, which is why things like the Megamis get their 666 to twin 8-inch upgrades before the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And, even for someone like, say, the US or the UK, it was fairly obvious that a war was coming. Everyone knew a war was coming. They didn't necessarily know exactly when a war was coming, but they knew that it was. So if you were in the US or the UK's position and you built similar vessels, then you would start as part of your general rearmament process once, obviously, the treaties have gone in the dustbin, so the late 1930s, that's when you would start upgrading everything so that you have it ready for when the war breaks out. I'm making this up as I go asks, reading Battleship Commander gave me a much better appreciation for Admiral Lee's role in pioneering the CIC, including the makeshift version he developed aboard Washington as early as 1942. Until then, I'd assumed the concept wasn't actually installed until after Nimitz's Thanksgiving tactical bulletin, given what happened to Callahan and Scott off Savo Island. Outside of anti-aircraft work and fighter direction, did a functioning CIC ever make a demonstrable tactical difference in a surface engagement involving US or Royal Navy heavy units, or did the war end before doctrine caught up with the technology? Well, it is going to be difficult to find specific examples in large numbers because, of course, if you're looking at heavy engagements, so engagements between capital ships, there aren't a huge number of them in World War II period, and most of the ones that occur prior to late 42. But with that said, there certainly are some heavy surface engagements where a CIC, or in British parlance an operations room, do actually benefit the Allies quite considerably. The most obvious examples would be the Battle of Surigao Strait, obviously famously fought at night using American fire control radar. That fire control radar and a picture of what on earth is actually happening is all being coordinated through the CIC and then obviously routed down to the plotting room and so forth. So without the CIC to coordinate all that data, the level of destruction that the old battleships were able to unleash on the Japanese formation definitely wouldn't have occurred. And I think, if you like, from a very high-level analysis view, if you look at how much destruction those big US ships that had their CICs aboard actually did versus the number of attacks thrown at the Japanese by everything from PT boats to destroyers to cruisers, basically look at the ships that didn't have CICs or major CICs and look at the relative amount of damage inflicted versus attacks thrown, and you'll find that the CICs were making the big ships much, much more efficient, despite the fact that in theory close-range night action should have been an absolute dream for torpedo-armed craft like PT boats. And of course you also have the Battle of the North Cape, where the operations rooms on British ships were absolutely vital in first tracking Sharnhorst, then engaging Sharnhorst, then tracking her again, and eventually delivering her into the arms of Duke of York to finish her off. Again, all of that radar tracking, plotting, working out who's where and what they're doing, and are you friendly or not, and setting up the various ambushes that Sharnhorst fell into, all of that is done largely by the operations rooms, which, as I say, in American parlance would be CICs, both taking orders and relaying information to the various commanders on their ships' bridges. The past is another country asks, the US favoured firepower and protection over speed with the standards. The French had a need for speed when it came to their interwar period designs. Did any other countries have a national ethos, as it were, when it came to speed, firepower and protection? And what is your preference for balancing the three? There certainly is a degree of national ethos in some navies. So the German Navy of World War I is very much an armour first doctrine. Firepower is, to a certain extent, much lower down their priority list. I mean, you can see the fact they start off with the 11-inch gun, and they only ever actually commissioned 2 ships with 15-inch guns, so 2 actual super dreadnoughts. Everything else is 12-inch guns. Speed-wise is kind of in the middle. The speed of the early German ships is quite low, so you could even argue with something like the Nassaus that they've put speed and firepower way down the bucket list and prioritized armour above all. But some of that is also because they're using vertical triple expansion engines, whereas if you get to the Kaisers and the Koenigs, their speed is pretty average, so you could argue that speed is the intermediate category. However, things also change. So, for example, with the Royal Navy in World War I, for the most part, goes with, if you like, average armour. The armour scheme outside of a handful of ships isn't particularly much to write home about in terms of, oh wow, this is so heavily armoured. They're decently armoured for the time. Average. But they definitely do like their firepower. And they are pushing a little bit for speed. So they're not deprioritising anywhere, but they are definitely prioritising firepower and then pushing speed somewhat. Because, yes, everyone's battle line ends up being 21 knots for dreadnoughts, but dreadnought is 3 knots faster than the average pre-dreadnought when it initially hits the water, and then you get things like the Queen Elizabeths and the Revengers, which are pushing the speed envelope again. But you flip that round to World War II when you look at something like the King George V design, and now, speed has now dropped to kind of intermediate. They're about as fast as anyone else's actual treaty-obeying battleships, with the exception of the French. But they're incredibly heavily protected. So they've now gone, really, really heavily in for armour. But firepower, it's okay, but it's nothing great to write home about, especially once they cut down from 3 quads to 2 quads and a twin on the KGVs. So you could argue for the British at that point, the firepower has actually taken a back seat even to speed, and protection is paramount. Now, the way I would balance things is I tend to view warship design not necessarily as a case of if you put something at the bottom of your priority list, you are making it worse. I would tend to view it as if you imagine speed, protection, and firepower each on a scale of 0 to 10, where obviously 10 is the maximal amount you can have and 0 is you don't move, you don't have any armour, you don't have any guns. So if we take all the sliders are set to 5, which is basically average for the period, I would tend to view ship design as in you have 20 points, and obviously you start off with 15 of them spent getting a 555 ship. You can then allocate your remaining 5 points, but if you want to go even more, you have to then obviously start taking away from one or the other. So my personal ideal ship at that point would be a 677 ship, assuming you're talking about speed, protection, and firepower. So just a little bit faster, maybe a knot or two faster than average, but put a decent amount of armour on it and a decent amount of firepower on it. So don't go completely overboard in either of those categories, because you'll end up having to sacrifice in others. So if we said, for example, and I know this isn't actually true, but if we said, for argument's sake, that the average treaty battleship had 27 knot top speed, 8 15-inch guns, and 13-inch armour, then a 677 vessel, which would be my type, would be a 28 to 29 knot ship with either 8 16-inch guns or 9 15-inch guns and 15 inches of armour. That would be my ideal balance. I don't think pushing extremes ever tends to really work out for the most part, because assuming that your tonnage is roughly on a par with everybody else, you're going to end up sacrificing something very, very critical. Now, of course, you can get, say, decent protection, heavy firepower, and high speed, like, say, the Iowas, but that involves adding another 10,000 tons to your ship, which at that point you now have to start comparing against other roughly 45,000 tonners. And finally, for this half of the Patreon Drydock, Thomas Farley asks, one of the justifications given for the Guadalcanal campaign was that a Japanese-held Henderson Field would be a huge threat to shipping routes between Australia and the US. I've never really understood this. After all, there aren't any strategic choke points like the Straits of Gibraltar or the Malacca Straits nearby. So how is this considered a threat? If British shipping can detour around the whole of Africa, then surely American shipping can sail a bit further south or east to avoid Japanese aircraft. To a certain degree, yes. A lot of shipping at the time was passing either via or near New Caledonia and then heading to Australia. In theory, you could swing further south to kind of just off of the north coast of New Zealand. However, the extreme range of Japanese aircraft, particularly their larger aircraft like the H-6K seen here, or the G4M, etc., makes it a very difficult proposition generally. And that's because having Henderson Field and the associated area under Japanese control puts both Brisbane and Sydney within comfortable range of long-range operations by some of these larger Japanese aircraft. So obviously that means that the shipping route that goes between the Solomon Islands and New Caledonia would be closed, but to a certain degree, especially with something like the H6K or the H8K, you might actually be vulnerable going anywhere north of New Zealand. You might either have to go between the North and South Islands via Wellington or just around New Zealand entirely to be completely free of roving Japanese aircraft if they were based in and around Henderson. And even when they get to Australia, you could potentially get Japanese air raids hitting Brisbane and Sydney or the approaches to Brisbane and Sydney, and thus whatever diversion routes you do don't actually make much odds. Essentially, almost all shipping would have to go into Melbourne, which would probably overwhelm Melbourne's harbours, and you'd still have to ship a lot of that stuff further north. Because remember, a lot of it is going to help in the New Guinea campaign, and of course, aircraft based at Henderson would be able to interdict any shipping that was taking supplies from Australia to New Guinea, even after you'd done a complicated overland transshipment from Melbourne. Plus, of course, if you can regularly bomb New Caledonia, then it's not too difficult to imagine the Japanese deciding that would be next on their list, and that just expands the problem still further. And that's it for the first half of Drydock episode 399. Thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you in part 2 coming up soon.